The Persian Wars had ended with Greek victory, but the aftermath created a power vacuum that would reshape the entire Mediterranean world. As Xerxes' massive invasion force retreated across the Hellespont in 479 BC, leaving behind the smouldering ruins of Persian ambitions in mainland Greece, two distinct Greek powers emerged from the conflict fundamentally transformed. Athens, having witnessed its own city burned and its population evacuated to Salamis, now possessed the largest and most experienced navy in the Greek world. Sparta, the traditional hegemon of the Peloponnese, found itself commanding unprecedented respect among Greek city-states after its heroic stand at Thermopylae and decisive victory at Plataea. The formation of what would become known as the Delian League began almost immediately after the Persian retreat. In 478 BC, representatives from numerous Greek city-states gathered on the sacred island of Delos to formalize an alliance that would continue the war against Persia and liberate Greek cities still under Persian control in Asia Minor and the eastern Aegean. The initial structure appeared genuinely cooperative. Each member state would contribute either ships and crews or monetary tribute calculated according to their resources and capabilities. The treasury would remain on neutral Delos under the protection of Apollo, and major decisions would theoretically require consensus among the allies. Athens assumed leadership of this confederation not through coercion, but through practical necessity. The Athenian fleet had proven itself the most effective anti-Persian force, and Athenian admirals like Cimon possessed both the tactical expertise and strategic vision necessary for sustained naval operations across the Aegean. The early campaigns vindicated this choice spectacularly. Between 478 and 470 BC, Athenian-led forces systematically expelled Persian garrisons from Ion, Skyros, and the crucial Chersonese Peninsula, while establishing Athenian clerici colonies that served both as strategic bases and outlets for Athens' growing population pressure. The transformation from alliance to empire occurred gradually but inexorably. The first decisive moment came when Naxos attempted to withdraw from the League around 470 BC. The Naxians, having contributed their acquired ships and crews for several successful campaigns, believed they had fulfilled their obligations and sought to resume complete independence. Athens responded with overwhelming force, besieging Naxos until the city capitulated and agreed to pay monetary tribute instead of providing ships. This precedent established the principle that membership in the Delian League was permanent and that Athens would determine the acceptable forms of contribution. The Battle of the Eurymedon River in 469 BC marked both the military zenith of the early Delian League and a crucial step toward Athenian dominance. Simon's forces achieved a rare double victory, defeating the Persian fleet in a naval engagement and then immediately landing to destroy the Persian army on shore. This triumph effectively ended Persian naval power in the eastern Mediterranean and eliminated the primary external threat that had justified the League's existence. Yet, rather than dissolving the alliance, Athens began emphasizing new justifications for its continuation, protecting trade routes, maintaining Greek unity, and deterring future Persian resurgence. The steady conversion of allied ship contributions to monetary tribute accelerated this imperial transformation. By 460 BC, only Chios, Lesbos, and Samos still provided ships rather than money, while the vast majority of League members had become tribute-paying subjects. This shift served multiple Athenian interests simultaneously. Monetary tribute was more predictable and efficient than coordinating dozens of different naval contingents, while the reduction of allied fleets eliminated potential military rivals and created economic dependence on Athenian naval protection. The transfer of the League treasury from Delos to Athens in 454 BC represented the most brazen assertion of Athenian imperial control. Officially justified as a security measure following a disastrous Athenian expedition to Egypt that had ended in complete defeat, the relocation placed enormous financial resources directly under Athenian administration. The annual tribute, now totaling approximately 600 talents, flowed directly into Athens, where it funded not only naval operations, but increasingly ambitious domestic projects. The Parthenon, begun in 447 BC, was constructed largely with tribute money that had originally been contributed by allies for mutual defence against Persia. This imperial evolution provoked growing resentment throughout the Aegean. The revolt of Thasos in 465 BC demonstrated the lengths to which Athens would go to maintain its dominance. When the Thasians attempted to withdraw from the League following a dispute over mining rights and trading privileges, Athens besieged the island for over 2 years, ultimately forcing complete capitulation and the payment of massive indemnities. Similar harsh treatment awaited other cities that challenged Athenian authority, creating a climate of fear that maintained imperial cohesion through intimidation rather than genuine cooperation. While Athens was constructing its maritime empire, Sparta was simultaneously consolidating its own sphere of influence through very different methods. The Peloponnesian League, unlike its Athenian counterpart, maintained the fiction of voluntary association while operating through carefully managed oligarchic networks. Spartan policy focused on supporting conservative property-owning elites in allied cities, while suppressing democratic movements that might threaten established hierarchies. The Spartan dual kingship system, unique among Greek constitutions, provided both stability and flexibility in managing this confederation. The two royal houses, the Aegeans and Eurypontids, could pursue different diplomatic approaches simultaneously while maintaining internal balance through their rivalry. When one king advocated aggressive intervention, the other could counsel restraint, allowing Sparta to adapt its policies to changing circumstances without appearing inconsistent or weak. The Ephorate, 5 annually elected magistrates who wielded enormous executive power, served as the primary instrument of Spartan imperial management. Unlike Athenian officials who governed through direct administrative control, the ephors operated through informal networks of personal relationships and mutual obligation. A Spartan ephor might negotiate with oligarchic leaders in Corinth or Megara through private meetings and personal guarantees, rather than formal treaties, creating flexible arrangements that could be adjusted without public acknowledgement of policy changes. This system proved particularly effective in managing the diverse interests of Peloponnesian League members. Corinth, with its extensive trading networks and colonial empire, required different treatment than agricultural Messenia or pastoral Arcadia. The Spartans accommodated these variations through individualized arrangements that preserved local autonomy in domestic affairs while ensuring alignment on major strategic questions. Corinthian merchants could pursue their commercial interests freely provided they supported Spartan leadership in military matters, while Arcadian communities maintained their traditional social structures in exchange for providing hoplite contingents when required. The First Peloponnesian War, which erupted in 460 BC, emerged from the inevitable collision between these expanding spheres of influence. The immediate trigger came when Megara, seeking protection from Corinthian pressure, defected from the Peloponnesian League and allied with Athens. This defection provided Athens with crucial strategic advantages: control of the Megarian ports of Nisaea and Pegae, which commanded access to the Corinthian Gulf, and a forward base for operations against Spartan allies in central Greece. The conflict that followed differed fundamentally from later phases of the Peloponnesian War in its geographical scope and strategic objectives. Rather than a direct confrontation between Athens and Sparta, the fighting involved multiple simultaneous campaigns across Greece and the eastern Mediterranean. Athenian forces operated simultaneously in Egypt, supporting a revolt against Persian rule, while conducting land campaigns in central Greece and maintaining naval pressure throughout the Aegean. The Battle of Tanagra in 457 BC demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of this multi-front strategy. When a Spartan army marched north to assist Thebes against Athenian pressure, they encountered Athenian forces reinforced by Argive allies and Thessalian cavalry. The engagement itself proved inconclusive. Both sides claimed victory and withdrew from the field with heavy casualties, but the strategic implications favoured Athens. The Spartans had demonstrated their ability to project power beyond the Peloponnese, but they could not maintain sustained operations in central Greece, while simultaneously managing threats closer to home. 2 months after Tanagra, Athenian forces under Myronidas won a decisive victory at Oenophyta that effectively secured Athenian control over Boeotia, Phocis, and Locris. This triumph created an Athenian land empire that complemented their maritime dominance, providing access to crucial resources and strategic positions that threatened traditional Spartan allies. The fortification of Naupactus, captured from the Ozolian Locrians, gave Athens a permanent naval base commanding the entrance to the Corinthian Gulf and threatening Peloponnesian communications with western Greece. The Egyptian expedition, launched simultaneously with these mainland campaigns, initially promised even greater rewards. The Persian satrap Achaemenes had died, fighting against Egyptian rebels led by Inaros, and Persian control over the wealthy Nile Delta appeared to be collapsing. Athenian naval intervention, coordinating with Libyan allies and Egyptian insurgents, achieved a remarkable initial success, capturing Memphis and besieging the Persian garrison in the White Castle fortress. However, the Egyptian campaign ultimately demonstrated the dangers of Athenian overextension. When the Persian general Megabyzus arrived with a substantial army and diverted the Nile to strand the Athenian fleet, the entire expedition faced catastrophe. The loss of nearly 200 ships and thousands of experienced crews in 454 BC represented the greatest military disaster in Athenian history to that point, eliminating much of the naval superiority that had enabled their aggressive expansion. This defeat forced a fundamental reassessment of Athenian strategy and contributed directly to the treasury transfer from Delos. The surviving Athenian forces, trapped on the island of Prosopitis for 18 months before their final destruction, had included contingents from numerous Delian League allies. The scale of the disaster raised questions about Athenian military competence and created opportunities for League members to reconsider their allegiances. The 30 Years' Peace, negotiated in 445 BC, reflected the exhaustion of both major powers and their recognition that neither could achieve decisive victory through continued warfare. The terms established clear spheres of influence that would govern Greek interstate relations for the next decade and a half. Athens retained its maritime empire and acknowledged Spartan hegemony over the Peloponnese, while both powers agreed to respect each other's alliances and submit disputes to arbitration. The treaty's most significant provisions addressed the status of neutral cities and the procedures for managing future conflicts. Any city not currently allied with either power could choose its own alignment, while existing alliances would remain inviolate. This arrangement recognised the bipolar reality that had emerged from the preceding conflicts, while attempting to prevent minor disputes from escalating into general warfare. The economic implications of this division became increasingly apparent as both powers adapted their domestic policies to support their respective imperial systems. Athens transformed itself into a commercial entrepot whose prosperity depended on maintaining secure sea lanes and extracting tribute from subject allies. The development of the Piraeus as a major trading centre, connected to Athens by the long walls completed in 458 BC, created a unified urban complex that could withstand siege as long as Athenian naval supremacy remained intact. The Athenian democracy evolved to accommodate this imperial role through institutional innovations that balance popular participation with effective administration. The introduction of pay for jury service, public offices, and military service ensured that even poor citizens could participate fully in political life, while the expansion of the citizen body through the settlement of cleroches in allied territory created new constituencies with direct interest in maintaining the empire. Spartan society, by contrast, became increasingly rigid and militarized, as the demands of maintaining hegemony over the Helot population and managing Peloponnesian League obligations stretched traditional institutions. The number of full Spartan citizens continued to decline as the economic pressures of maintaining military readiness eliminated families unable to contribute to the common messes, while the growing disparity between the small citizen elite and the much larger populations of perioeci and helots created internal tensions that required constant vigilance. These divergent social and economic developments reflected fundamentally different approaches to power and governance that would shape the coming conflict. Athenian imperialism was dynamic and expansionist, driven by commercial interests and democratic institutions that rewarded successful leadership through popular acclaim. Spartan hegemony was conservative and defensive, focused on preserving traditional hierarchies and preventing changes that might threaten the delicate balance between citizens, perioeci, and helots that made Spartan military dominance possible. The careful balance established by the 30 Years' Peace began to unravel almost immediately as the fundamental tensions between Athenian and Spartan imperial systems proved impossible to contain within the treaty's rigid framework. The first serious challenge emerged from an unexpected quarter, the remote island of Corcyra, whose strategic position at the mouth of the Adriatic had made it wealthy through trade with Sicily and southern Italy, but whose fierce independence had kept it aloof from the major power blocks that dominated mainland Greek politics. Corcyra's conflict with its mother city Corinth originated in a dispute over Epidamnus, a Corcyrian colony on the Illyrian coast that had been racked by civil war between democratic and oligarchic factions. When the Democrats gained the upper hand and expelled their opponents, the oligarchs fled to the surrounding barbarian tribes and began launching raids against the city. The desperate Epidamnian Democrats appealed first to Corcyra for assistance, but the Corcyrians, perhaps reluctant to become entangled in distant conflicts, refused to intervene. The Epidamnians then turned to Corinth, invoking the ancient colonial relationship that made Corinth the ultimate mother city of Epidamnus through its founding of Corcyra. The Corinthians saw an opportunity to reassert their influence over wayward colonies and agreed to provide military support. They dispatched a relief force of 2,000 hoplites and 200 cavalry, along with volunteers recruited from other Peloponnesian cities, eager to gain footholds in the lucrative western trade routes. This Corinthian intervention transformed a local civil conflict into a broader interstate crisis. The Corcyrians, viewing the Corinthian presence in Epidamnus as a direct threat to their own sphere of influence, mobilized their formidable fleet, second only to Athens in size among Greek naval forces, and imposed a blockade on the disputed city. They simultaneously issued an ultimatum demanding that Corinth withdraw its forces and submit the entire dispute to arbitration by mutually acceptable neutral parties. The Corinthians rejected these demands outright, arguing that their colonial rights gave them legitimate authority over Epidamnus regardless of Corcyrian objections. They began assembling an even larger expeditionary force, calling upon their Peloponnesian League allies for additional ships and troops. The Megarians contributed 20 vessels, the Eleans 10, and various other allied cities provided smaller contingents, creating a coalition fleet of approximately 150 ships, the largest Corinthian naval force ever assembled. Recognizing that they could not match this coalition alone, the Corcyrians took the unprecedented step of seeking an alliance with Athens. This decision marked a dramatic departure from their traditional policy of neutrality, but the Corcyrian ambassadors who arrived in Athens in 433 BC presented compelling arguments for why Athenian interests required intervention. They emphasized Corcyra's strategic position, controlling access to Sicily and southern Italy, regions that provided crucial grain imports for Athens and served as potential theatres for future expansion. The Corcyrian proposal created intense debate within the Athenian assembly. Conservative politicians, led by figures close to Pericles' rival, Thucydides, son of Melesias, argued that intervention would violate the spirit of the 30 Years' Peace and risk provoking Sparta into renewed warfare. They pointed out that the treaty explicitly prohibited either side from accepting allies who belonged to the other's sphere, and while Corcyra was technically neutral, an alliance would clearly be seen as Athenian expansion at Corinthian expense. The interventionist faction, however, marshalled equally persuasive arguments. They noted that Corcyra's naval strength, if added to the Corinthian fleet through conquest or coercion, would significantly alter the balance of power in the western Mediterranean. The combined Corinthian-Corcyrian fleet would rival Athens' own naval forces and provide Sparta's Peloponnesian League with unprecedented maritime capabilities. Moreover, they argued the treaty's provisions technically allowed either side to accept neutral allies, and Corcyra's independence made such an alliance legally permissible. Pericles ultimately supported a limited intervention, crafting a compromise that would protect Athenian interests while minimizing the risk of general war. Rather than a full offensive alliance, Athens would offer Corcyra a defensive pact that obligated Athenian assistance only if Corcyrian territory was directly attacked. This arrangement would deter Corinthian aggression without providing grounds for Spartan retaliation, since Athens would not be actively participating in offensive operations. The Athenian assembly approved this defensive alliance by a narrow margin, but the implementation revealed the inadequacy of such half measures in the face of escalating tensions. Athens initially dispatched only 10 ships under the command of Lacedaemonius, Simon's son, with strict instructions to avoid engaging Corinthian forces unless Corcyra itself was threatened. This token force was intended more as a diplomatic signal than a military intervention, demonstrating Athenian commitment while maintaining plausible deniability. The naval battle that erupted off Sybota in late summer 433 BC transformed this careful diplomatic manoeuvring into open conflict. The Corinthian fleet, numbering 150 ships arranged in traditional line formation, encountered the Corcyrian force of 110 vessels supported by the 10 Athenian triremes positioned on the right wing. The initial engagement followed conventional tactics, with both sides attempting to ram enemy vessels while avoiding being rammed in return, but the superior training and equipment of the Corinthian crews began to tell as the battle progressed. The Corinthians had arranged their fleet with their own vessels in the centre, flanked by contingents from Megara, Ambracia, Leucas, and Anactorium. Their crews included numerous experienced marines recruited from throughout the Peloponnese, while their ship commanders had been selected for proven competence in previous naval operations. The Corcyrians, despite possessing excellent vessels built from the abundant timber of their mountainous island, lacked comparable experience in large-scale fleet actions. As Corcyrian resistance began to crumble under sustained Corinthian pressure, the Athenian commanders faced an agonizing decision. Their instructions prohibited offensive action, but the complete destruction of the Corcyrian fleet would eliminate the strategic benefits that had justified Athenian intervention in the first place. When Corinthian ships began pursuing damaged Corcyrian vessels toward the shore, threatening to complete their victory through systematic destruction of the enemy fleet, the Athenian triremes abandoned their passive role and engaged directly. The intervention of the Athenian squadron, though numerically small, proved psychologically decisive. The sight of Athenian warships actively supporting their enemies convinced many Corinthian commanders that they were now facing the full might of the Delian League, rather than a limited Corcyrian force. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the choppy waters of Sybota, the Corinthian fleet began withdrawing toward their base at Loicema, abandoning their pursuit of the scattered Corcyrian vessels. The immediate aftermath of Sybota demonstrated how quickly limited conflicts could escalate beyond their original parameters. The Corinthians had technically achieved victory, sinking 70 Corcyrian ships while losing only 30 of their own, but they had failed to achieve their strategic objective of eliminating Corcyrian naval power. More importantly, they now had legitimate grievances against Athens for direct military intervention in support of their enemies. The Corinthian response revealed the depth of their anger and the sophistication of their strategic thinking. Rather than demanding immediate Spartan retaliation, they began systematically undermining Athenian interests throughout the Greek world, while building a coalition of allies who shared their resentment of Athenian imperial expansion. Their first target was Potidaea, a city whose complex political status made it vulnerable to pressure from multiple directions. Potidaea occupied a unique position in the emerging bipolar system, as both a Corinthian colony and an Athenian tributary. Located on the western prong of the Chalcidice Peninsula, the city controlled crucial overland routes between Macedonia and the Aegean, while serving as a major commercial centre for the surrounding region. The Potidæans paid tribute to Athens as members of the Delian League, but maintained traditional colonial ties to Corinth, including the annual appointment of Corinthian magistrates called epidemiurgoi, who supervised certain religious and judicial functions. This dual allegiance had functioned adequately during the period of the 30 Years' Peace, when both Athens and Corinth had incentives to avoid provocative actions that might destabilise the broader settlement. However, the Corcyraean crisis created new pressures that made Potidæa's balanced position increasingly untenable. The Athenians, suspicious of Corinthian influence following the Sybota engagement, began demanding that Potidæa demonstrate its loyalty through concrete actions that would sever its remaining ties to Corinth. The Athenian ultimatum delivered to Potidæa in 432 BC reflected both strategic necessity and imperial arrogance. The Athenians demanded that the Potidæans demolish the southern wall of their city, which faced toward the Peloponnese and could potentially facilitate a Corinthian invasion. They also required the expulsion of all Corinthian magistrates and the provision of hostages from prominent families to guarantee future loyalty. Most provocatively, they insisted that Potidæa abandon its alliance with the Chalcidian League, a confederation of neighbouring cities that provided mutual defence against Thracian raids. These demands placed the Potidæans in an impossible position. Compliance would effectively end their independence and reduce them to the status of a subject city completely dependent on Athenian goodwill. Resistance, however, would invite immediate military retaliation from the most powerful naval force in the Greek world. The Potidæan assembly debated these alternatives through the winter of 432 BC, while secretly dispatching envoys to both Corinth and Sparta seeking support for resistance. The Corinthian response demonstrated their commitment to challenging Athenian expansion, even at considerable risk to themselves. They promised military assistance if Potidæa chose to revolt, while simultaneously encouraging other Chalcidian cities to coordinate their resistance. More significantly, they began recruiting volunteers throughout the Peloponnese for an expeditionary force that would operate far from Spartan oversight, allowing Corinth to support anti-Athenian activities without technically violating the peace treaty. The Spartan government's private assurances to Potidæan envoys represented an even more dramatic escalation. While stopping short of promising immediate military intervention, the ephors indicated that Sparta would not abandon Potidæa if conflict erupted, and they hinted that a general invasion of Attica might be launched to relieve pressure on Chalcidice. These commitments, delivered through informal channels that preserved official deniability, gave the Potidæans sufficient confidence to reject the Athenian ultimatum. The Potidæan revolt began in spring 432 BC with the dramatic expulsion of Athenian tax collectors and the public rejection of tributary obligations. The rebels immediately began strengthening their fortifications while coordinating with neighbouring Chalcidian cities that had simultaneously declared their independence from Athenian control. The city of Olynthus emerged as the leader of this broader rebellion, offering refuge to rural populations and serving as a coordination centre for anti-Athenian resistance throughout the peninsula. The Athenian response revealed both the strengths and limitations of their imperial system. They could mobilise substantial military forces quickly, dispatching 30 ships and 1,000 hoplites under Archestratus within weeks of receiving news of the revolt. However, the siege that followed demonstrated how expensive it could be to maintain control over distant territories when local populations were actively hostile and external powers provided covert support. The siege of Potidæa became a grinding war of attrition that consumed enormous resources over more than 2 years. The Athenians established fortified lines completely surrounding the city, cutting off land-based supply routes while maintaining naval blockades that prevented seaborne relief. The Potidæans responded by rationing food supplies and organising desperate sorties designed to break the encirclement, while hoping that promised Corinthian and Spartan assistance would arrive before starvation forced surrender. The arrival of Aristeas with 2,000 Corinthian volunteers marked a significant escalation in the conflict's scope and intensity. These troops, officially described as private adventurers rather than state forces, included experienced veterans of previous campaigns and were equipped with the finest armour and weapons that Corinthian resources could provide. Their presence transformed the siege from a police action against rebellious subjects into a proxy war between the major Greek powers. The financial costs of the Potidæan siege created severe strains on the Athenian treasury that would influence imperial policy for years to come. The expedition required not only the initial deployment of substantial forces but also continuous reinforcement as casualties mounted and the siege dragged on without resolution. The annual cost exceeded 2,000 talents, more than 3 times the normal tribute assessment, for the entire Chalcidice region, while producing no compensating benefit in terms of increased revenue or strategic advantage. These mounting expenses coincided with Pericles' implementation of the Megarian Decree, an economic sanctions regime that demonstrated Athenian willingness to use commercial warfare as an instrument of imperial policy. The decree prohibited Megarian merchants from trading in any port controlled by Athens or its allies, effectively excluding them from the majority of profitable commercial routes in the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean. The Megarian decree emerged from a complex web of grievances and strategic calculations that reflected the deteriorating relationship between Athens and the Peloponnesian League. The immediate pretext involved Megarian cultivation of sacred land belonging to Demeter and allegations that Megara was harbouring runaway slaves, but these charges served primarily to justify measures that had deeper political and economic motivations. The economic impact on Megara was devastating and immediate. Megarian merchants, who had previously conducted extensive trade with Athenian colonies and allied cities throughout the eastern Mediterranean, found themselves excluded from markets that had provided the foundation of their prosperity. The city's strategic position on the Isthmus of Corinth, which had made it a crucial link between the Peloponnese and central Greece, became a liability when Athenian naval power could interdict seaborne commerce, while land routes remained subject to political restrictions. The broader implications of the Megarian decree extended far beyond its immediate economic effects. By demonstrating Athens' ability to strangle the commerce of cities that opposed its policies, the decree served as a warning to other potential opponents while showcasing the practical benefits of Athenian alliance to neutral cities. The message was clear. Prosperity in the Greek world increasingly depended on maintaining good relations with Athens and accepting the constraints that such relationships entailed. The Corinthian response to these mounting pressures revealed the sophistication of their diplomatic strategy and their understanding of Spartan decision-making processes. Rather than demanding immediate military action, they focused on building a broad coalition of allies who shared grievances against Athenian expansion. They coordinated with Megarian representatives to present a unified case for Spartan intervention, while simultaneously encouraging Aegian complaints about Athenian violations of their autonomy. The Spartan assembly that convened in late summer 432 BC faced unprecedented pressure from allies, whose patience with Athenian aggression had reached its breaking point. The Corinthian delegates, led by experienced diplomats who understood Spartan political culture, carefully framed their arguments in terms of honour and obligation rather than immediate self-interest. They emphasised that Spartan credibility as a hegemon depended on protecting allies who had remained loyal despite Athenian pressure, and they warned that failure to act would encourage further Athenian expansion that would eventually threaten Sparta itself. The Megarian representatives provided concrete evidence of Athenian economic warfare, describing how the trade restrictions had reduced their city to near starvation, while demonstrating Athens' willingness to use its commercial dominance as a weapon against political opponents. They argued that the Megarian decree violated the spirit of the 30 Years' Peace by constituting an act of economic aggression that achieved through commercial pressure what military conquest would accomplish through force. The Aegean delegation, speaking for a city that had been forcibly incorporated into the Athenian Empire despite its previous independence, provided the most damning testimony about Athenian imperial methods. They described systematic interference in local governance, the imposition of tribute assessments that exceeded the city's capacity to pay, and the gradual erosion of traditional institutions through Athenian administrative pressure. The most powerful moment in these proceedings came when the Corinthian speakers delivered their ultimatum regarding future alliance relationships. They declared that Corinth could no longer maintain its loyalty to Sparta if Spartan inaction continued to enable Athenian aggression against Corinthian interests and allies. This threat to seek alternative alliances, possibly including accommodation with Athens or the creation of an independent power bloc, struck at the heart of Spartan strategic concerns about maintaining Peloponnesian unity. King Archidamus attempted to moderate the assembly's response by emphasizing the risks of premature warfare and the advantages of continued diplomatic pressure. He pointed out that Sparta was not yet adequately prepared for a prolonged conflict against Athenian naval power, and he suggested that additional time might allow for the development of alternative strategies that could achieve Spartan objectives without the enormous costs of general warfare. However, the Ephesthenileidas, representing the more aggressive faction within Spartan leadership, argued that further delay would only strengthen Athenian positions while weakening Spartan credibility among crucial allies. He emphasized that the 30 Years' Peace had already been violated through Athenian actions at Sybota and Potidaea, making Spartan retaliation not only justified, but necessary to preserve the balance of power that the treaty had originally established. The final vote in the Spartan assembly was decisive but not unanimous, reflecting the genuine divisions within Spartan society about the wisdom of renewed warfare. The majority concluded that Athenian violations of the peace settlement had become so systematic and flagrant that military response was unavoidable, but significant minorities continued to advocate for diplomatic solutions that might preserve peace while addressing legitimate allied grievances. The Spartan decision to declare that the Athenians had broken the peace treaty set in motion a chain of events that would transform the entire Greek world over the following decades. Yet even as the assembly voted for war, both sides continued to hope that diplomatic negotiations might yet prevent the catastrophic conflict that now seemed increasingly inevitable. The formal declaration of war by the Spartan assembly in late 432 BC initiated a conflict that would fundamentally reshape the Greek world. Yet the opening moves revealed how unprepared both sides remained for the unprecedented scale and duration of the struggle ahead. Pericles, now approaching 60 years of age and at the height of his political influence, had spent the winter months of 431 BC developing a comprehensive strategy that would leverage Athenian naval supremacy while minimizing exposure to Spartan military advantages. His approach represented a radical departure from traditional Greek warfare, which typically involved decisive hoplite battles that resolve conflicts within a single campaigning season. The Periclean strategy rested on several interconnected assumptions about Athenian strengths and Spartan limitations. The long walls, completed nearly 3 decades earlier, created an impregnable corridor connecting Athens to its port at Piraeus, ensuring that Athenian access to the sea could not be severed by land-based siege operations. The Athenian fleet, numbering approximately 300 triremes with experienced crews drawn from throughout the empire, possessed undisputed mastery of the Aegean and could project power anywhere along the extensive Mediterranean coastline. Most crucially, the annual tribute flowing from Delian League members provided Athens with financial resources that dwarfed anything available to Sparta or its Peloponnesian allies. Pericles calculated that Spartan society, organised around the agricultural labour of Helot populations and the military service of a small citizen elite, could not sustain prolonged campaigns that required extended absence from the Peloponnese. The Spartan army, while formidable in pitched battle, depended on seasonal mobilization patterns that reflected the agricultural cycle. Spartan citizens needed to return home for harvest and planting, while the constant threat of Helot rebellion made it dangerous to maintain large forces in distant territories for extended periods. The Athenian leaders' defensive strategy deliberately sacrificed the rural territory of Attica to focus resources on maintaining naval dominance and protecting the urban population concentrated within the long walls. This approach required extraordinary discipline from the Athenian citizenry, who would be forced to abandon their ancestral farms and watch helplessly as Spartan forces destroyed crops, cut down olive trees, and demolished rural sanctuaries that had defined Attic religious and cultural life for centuries. The psychological dimensions of this strategy were as important as its military components. Pericles understood that Athenian morale would face severe testing as rural populations crowded into an urban space never designed to accommodate such numbers. The city's infrastructure, adequate for a population of perhaps 40,000 citizens plus their families, would need to support nearly twice that number while maintaining the complex logistics required for naval operations and imperial administration. The first Spartan invasion of Attica began in late May 431 BC, when King Archidamus II led an army of approximately 60,000 men across the Megarian border into the Thriasian plain. The invasion force included not only the full Spartan citizen levy, but also substantial contingents from major Peloponnesian League allies: Corinthian hoplites seeking revenge for their defeats at Sybota, Megarian troops familiar with Attic terrain, and Boeotian forces under Theban leadership that brought the army's total strength to unprecedented levels. Archidamus had spent months planning this invasion, studying reports from Megarian allies about Athenian defensive preparations and consulting with exiled Athenian oligarchs who provided detailed intelligence about rural strongholds and supply routes. The Spartan king understood that his army's effectiveness would depend on its ability to force the Athenians into battle by threatening assets they could not afford to lose, yet he also recognized the risks of extended operations in hostile territory, where Athenian naval forces could potentially cut his supply lines. The Spartan army's advance through Attica followed a carefully planned route designed to maximize psychological pressure on the Athenian population. Rather than marching directly toward Athens, Archidamus led his forces through the fertile Thriasian plain, where extensive grain fields and olive groves provided visible targets for systematic destruction. Spartan engineers had brought specialized equipment for cutting down mature olive trees, understanding that the economic impact of destroying these slow-growing assets would persist for decades after the war's conclusion. The sight of smoke rising from burning farmsteads throughout northern Attica created exactly the psychological effect that Archidamus had intended. Rural Athenians who had evacuated their properties in accordance with Pericles' strategy could observe the destruction of their life's work from the walls of Athens, creating enormous pressure on the democratic assembly to authorize immediate military response. The wealthier citizens, whose extensive estates included not only agricultural land but also country houses, slave quarters, and private shrines, faced losses that represented generations of accumulated wealth. The refugee crisis that developed within Athens during the first weeks of the invasion tested every aspect of urban infrastructure and social organisation. The city's residential areas, designed around the traditional pattern of individual households with private courtyards and gardens, could not accommodate the massive influx of displaced persons. Families who had never lived in close proximity to their neighbours found themselves sharing cramped quarters with relatives and strangers, while sanitation systems designed for a much smaller population quickly became overwhelmed. The most serious overcrowding occurred in the area between the long walls, where thousands of rural families established makeshift camps using whatever materials they could salvage from their abandoned properties. These improvised settlements lacked adequate water supplies, proper drainage, or organise waste disposal, creating conditions that would prove catastrophic when epidemic disease struck the following year. The wealthy could purchase accommodation in private houses or rent space in the few available public buildings, but the majority of refugees lived in conditions of unprecedented squalor. Pericles faced mounting pressure from the assembly to authorise immediate military action as reports of destruction throughout Attica continued to arrive. The democratic institutions that had enabled his rise to power now threatened to undermine his strategic vision, as angry citizens demanded explanations for why the most powerful military force in the Greek world was refusing to defend its own territory. The assembly meetings during this period were marked by emotional speeches from citizens who described watching their ancestral properties burn, while Athenian hoplites remained safely within the city walls. The Athenian leader's response to these pressures demonstrated both his political skill and his unwavering commitment to the defensive strategy. Rather than attempting to justify the abandonment of rural Attica through abstract strategic arguments, Pericles focused on concrete examples of Athenian advantages that would ultimately ensure victory. He reminded the assembly that Athens controlled more financial resources than all of Sparta's allies combined, possessing a treasury reserve of 6,000 talents, plus annual tribute income that exceeded 600 talents from League members. More importantly, Pericles emphasised the unique nature of Athenian naval power and its implications for the broader conflict. While the Spartan army could destroy property and crops within Attica, it could not threaten the fundamental sources of Athenian strength: the tribute-paying cities of the Aegean, the commercial networks that generated enormous customs revenues, and the overseas territories that provided essential grain imports. The Athenian fleet could retaliate against Spartan interests throughout the Peloponnese, while remaining completely immune to land-based counterattacks. The implementation of this naval strategy began even as Archidamus was ravaging the Attic countryside. A fleet of 100 Athenian triremes under the command of Carcinus departed Piraeus in early June, carrying 1,000 hoplites and 400 archers for amphibious operations against Peloponnesian coastal targets. This force represented the largest Athenian naval expedition since the Egyptian disaster of 454 BC, demonstrating the empire's recovery and its commitment to offensive operations despite the defensive posture adopted in Attica itself. The Athenian naval raids that followed revealed both the potential and limitations of seaborne warfare against land-based powers. The fleet's first target was Methone in Messenia, a small coastal city that served as a supply depot for Spartan operations in the western Peloponnese. The Athenian landing force encountered minimal resistance from the local garrison, which had not anticipated seaborne attack and lacked adequate fortifications to withstand professional siege equipment. The systematic destruction of Methone's harbour facilities and grain warehouses demonstrated Athens' ability to strike Spartan interests far from the main theatre of operations. Subsequent raids along the Laconian coast achieved similar tactical success, while revealing the strategic limitations of hit-and-run warfare. Athenian forces could land almost anywhere along the extensive Peloponnesian coastline, destroy exposed targets, and withdraw before significant enemy forces could respond. However, these operations, while psychologically satisfying for Athenians watching their own territory burn, could not inflict damage comparable to what Spartan armies were achieving in Attica. Coastal raids destroyed individual settlements and disrupted local commerce, but they could not threaten the agricultural foundations of Spartan power or force decisive political changes. The most significant early naval operation targeted the island of Aegina, whose strategic position in the Saronic Gulf made it a crucial base for controlling access to Athenian territory. The Aeginetans, despite their forced incorporation into the Athenian Empire following their defeat in 457 BC, had maintained covert communications with Spartan agents and were suspected of providing intelligence about Athenian naval movements. The Athenian response involved the complete deportation of the island's population and the establishment of an Athenian clerishy that would ensure permanent loyalty. The expulsion of the Aegianetans demonstrated the ruthless efficiency with which Athens could eliminate potential threats within its sphere of control. Athenian triremes surrounded the island, while hoplite forces landed at multiple points, systematically rounding up the entire population for transport to Spartan territory. The operation, completed within a matter of days, eliminated a potential fifth column while providing Athens with a secure naval base that could support future operations in the western Saronic Gulf. These naval successes, however impressive tactically, could not compensate for the mounting psychological pressure created by the continued Spartan presence in Attica. Archidamus had established his army's base camp at Ashane, the largest of the Attic demes and a stronghold of citizens known for their fierce patriotism and military prowess. The choice of this location was deliberately provocative, as the Iconians had provided some of Athens' most distinguished military leaders and were known for their aggressive advocacy of offensive military action. The destruction of Achane created a political crisis that threatened to undermine Pericles' entire strategy. The Dem's citizens, who numbered nearly 3,000 adult males and represented a significant voting bloc within the assembly, demanded immediate military action to save their community from complete destruction. Their emotional appeals, supported by graphic descriptions of Spartan soldiers systematically destroying private shrines and family burial plots, created enormous pressure for abandoning the defensive strategy in favour of the immediate hoplite engagement. Pericles' response to this crisis revealed his understanding of democratic politics and his skill in managing popular emotions during periods of extreme stress. Rather than attempting to suppress assembly meetings or limit debate, he chose to avoid calling the assembly into session while the Spartan army remained in Attica. This tactical manoeuvre prevented formal votes that might have mandated military action, while allowing popular anger to dissipate as citizens observed the ultimate failure of Spartan strategy to achieve decisive results. The Spartan withdrawal in late July, after approximately 40 days of operations in Attica, vindicated Pericles' assessment of enemy limitations, while demonstrating the effectiveness of Athenian defensive preparations. Archidamus had achieved significant tactical success in terms of property destruction and psychological pressure, but he had failed to force the decisive battle that might have ended the war quickly. The Spartan army's departure revealed the seasonal constraints that would limit enemy operations throughout the conflict, as citizen soldiers needed to return home for harvest activities that could not be postponed without risking economic catastrophe. The aftermath of this first invasion saw both sides reassessing their strategies in light of lessons learned during the initial campaigning season. The Spartans had demonstrated their ability to inflict substantial economic damage on Athenian territory, but they had also revealed the limitations of traditional land warfare against an enemy protected by impregnable fortifications and supplied by sea. The Athenians had successfully maintained their defensive posture despite enormous psychological pressure, but they had also experienced the domestic political costs of allowing enemy forces to operate freely within their territory. The devastating plague that struck Athens in 430 BC transformed the strategic situation in ways that neither side had anticipated. The epidemic, which modern scholars believe may have been typhus, typhoid fever, or a hemorrhagic fever similar to Ebola, emerged during the summer campaigning season when overcrowded conditions within the long walls created ideal circumstances for rapid disease transmission. The initial symptoms included severe fever, headache, and inflammation of the throat and tongue, followed by stomach upset, diarrhea, and eventually skin lesions and gangrene of the extremities. The plague's impact on Athenian society extended far beyond its immediate mortality, which may have reached 1/3 of the total population by the time the epidemic finally subsided in 426 BC. The disease struck all social classes indiscriminately, killing wealthy citizens who could afford the best medical care as readily as poor refugees crowded into the makeshift settlements between the long walls. This democratic character of the plague's devastation undermined traditional social hierarchies while creating unprecedented challenges for maintaining civic institutions and military organizations. The medical knowledge available to Athenian physicians proved completely inadequate for understanding or treating the epidemic. The prevailing theories of disease, based on imbalances of bodily humours and environmental factors, provided no guidance for dealing with a contagious disease that spread rapidly through human contact. Attempts at treatment, including bloodletting, purging and various herbal remedies, often worsened patients' conditions while exposing caregivers to infection. The city's temples, traditionally places of healing and divine intervention, became overcrowded with desperate patients and soon turned into charnel houses where the dead and dying lay together in horrific conditions. The social consequences of the plague proved as devastating as its medical effects. Traditional funeral practices, which required elaborate ceremonies and proper burial of the dead, became impossible to maintain as deaths occurred faster than bodies could be processed. Families began abandoning their deceased relatives in public spaces, while others resorted to cremating bodies on funeral pyres intended for other families. The breakdown of normal mortuary practices created profound religious anxiety, as proper burial was considered essential for ensuring the peaceful rest of the dead and maintaining favour with the gods. The economic disruption caused by the plague compounded the damage already inflicted by Spartan invasions and the costs of maintaining naval operations. Skilled craftsmen, merchants and administrators died in large numbers, disrupting the complex economic networks that supported Athenian imperial administration. The tribute collection system, which required experienced officials to negotiate with allied cities and supervise financial transfers, suffered particularly severe disruption as key personnel succumbed to disease. Several major allied cities, observing Athenian weakness, began withholding tribute payments or reducing their contributions without authorization. Pericles himself fell victim to the plague in 429 BC, succumbing to the disease that had already claimed 2 of his sons and numerous close associates. His death represented not only the loss of Athens' most experienced political leader, but also the end of the strategic vision that had guided Athenian policy since the war's beginning. The Democratic Assembly, faced with mounting military pressures and unprecedented domestic crisis, began searching for new leadership and alternative strategies that might restore Athenian fortunes. The plague's impact on Athenian military capabilities became apparent during the Second Spartan invasion of Attica in 430 BC, when King Archidamus again led Peloponnesian forces into Attic territory. The Athenian response to this invasion revealed the extent to which disease had weakened both military capacity and civilian morale. The naval raids that had characterized Athenian strategy during the previous year were significantly reduced in scale and effectiveness, as experienced crews had been decimated by plague and replacement personnel lacked adequate training for complex amphibious operations. The death of Pericles in 429 BC created a political vacuum that fundamentally altered the character of Athenian democracy and military strategy. Without the moderating influence of the city's most experienced statesmen, the assembly became increasingly susceptible to the emotional appeals of politicians who promised quick victories and aggressive action against Athens' enemies. The plague had not only devastated the population, but had also eliminated many of the older, more conservative citizens who had traditionally supported Pericles' cautious approach to imperial management. The survivors, traumatized by loss and desperate for decisive action that might restore Athenian prestige, proved receptive to leaders who advocated radical departures from established policy. Cleon, son of Cleonetus, emerged as the most prominent of these new political figures, representing a dramatic shift from the aristocratic leadership that had dominated Athenian politics since the Persian Wars. Unlike Pericles, who had inherited wealth and social position that provided independence from popular pressure, Cleon derived his fortune from a tanning business that served ordinary citizens and gave him intimate knowledge of their concerns and prejudices. His political rhetoric reflected this background, employing the crude language of the marketplace rather than the refined philosophical discourse favoured by traditional elites. The new demagogue's rise to prominence coincided with growing frustration over the defensive strategy that had characterised the first years of the war. Athenian citizens, watching their rural properties burn year after year while their navy conducted seemingly ineffective raids against distant Peloponnesian targets, demanded more aggressive action that would bring the conflict to a decisive conclusion. Cleon understood these popular sentiments and crafted his political message around promises of military victory achieved through superior Athenian resources and imperial power. The first major test of this new political climate came with the revolt of Mytilene in 428 BC, when the largest city on Lesbos attempted to withdraw from the Delian League and align itself with Sparta. The Mytileneans had carefully prepared their rebellion, constructing new fortifications with Spartan financial assistance, while secretly negotiating military support from other Peloponnesian League members. Their revolt represented the most serious challenge to Athenian imperial authority since the war's beginning, threatening to inspire similar defections throughout the Aegean if Athens failed to respond with overwhelming force. The Mytilenean conspiracy had been developing for several years, with oligarchic leaders maintaining covert communications with Spartan agents while publicly professing loyalty to Athens. The conspirators had timed their revolt to coincide with the annual Spartan invasion of Attica, calculating that Athenian forces would be too dispersed to respond effectively to simultaneous threats in multiple theatres. They had also secured promises of naval support from Corinth and other maritime allies, hoping to break the Athenian blockade that would inevitably follow their declaration of independence. The Athenian response revealed both the empire's continued military capabilities and the increasingly harsh methods that characterized imperial administration under democratic pressure. The assembly immediately authorized the dispatch of 40 triremes under Kallipides, followed by additional reinforcements that brought the total siege force to over 100 vessels. This massive naval commitment, representing nearly one-third of Athens' available fleet, demonstrated the empire's determination to crush the revolt regardless of cost. The siege of Mytilene that followed became a grinding test of endurance that lasted over a year and consumed enormous resources while revealing the limitations of naval blockade against a well-fortified city with determined defenders. The Athenian fleet established bases on nearby islands and constructed fortified positions on Lesbos itself, but the city's strong walls and adequate food supplies enabled prolonged resistance. The Mytileneans had stockpiled grain and other essential supplies before declaring their revolt, while fishing boats and small vessels could occasionally slip through the Athenian blockade to provide limited resupply. The arrival of a small Spartan squadron under Alcidas in spring 427 BC briefly raised Mytilenean hopes for effective relief, but the Spartan commander's cautious approach revealed the limitations of Peloponnesian naval capabilities. Alcidas commanded only 42 ships, insufficient to challenge the much larger Athenian fleet directly, and his crews lacked experience in the complex maneuvers required for effective naval combat. When Athenian scouts reported the Spartan approach, Alcidas chose to withdraw rather than risk a decisive engagement that might eliminate Sparta's modest naval forces entirely. The collapse of Mytilenean resistance in summer 427 BC occurred suddenly when the city's food supplies reached critical levels and popular discontent with the oligarchic leadership reached the breaking point. The common citizens, who had never enthusiastically supported the revolt and were now facing starvation, opened negotiations with the Athenian commanders for terms of surrender. The oligarchs, recognizing that their position had become hopeless, attempted to negotiate their own separate agreement but found that Athenian patience had been exhausted by the prolonged siege. The debate that followed in the Athenian assembly over the appropriate punishment for Mytilene revealed the transformation of democratic discourse under the pressure of prolonged warfare. Cleon advocated the complete destruction of the city and the execution of all adult male citizens, arguing that such harsh measures were necessary to deter future revolts and demonstrate Athenian resolve. His speech, as recorded by Thucydides, reflected the brutal logic of imperial control and the demagogue's understanding of popular emotions shaped by years of suffering and sacrifice. Cleon's argument rested on the premise that mercy toward rebellious allies would be interpreted as weakness and would encourage further defections that could ultimately destroy the empire. He pointed out that the Mytileneans had enjoyed favourable treatment under Athenian rule, paying reduced tribute and maintaining local autonomy, yet had still chosen to revolt at the first opportunity. This betrayal, he argued, demonstrated that gratitude and moderation were ineffective tools for maintaining imperial control, and that only fear of overwhelming punishment could ensure continued loyalty. The demagogue also appealed to popular resentment over the costs of suppressing the revolt, emphasising the enormous financial expenditure and the lives lost during the prolonged siege. He calculated these costs in terms that ordinary citizens could understand, noting that the tribute that would have been collected from Mytilene and other allied cities could have funded significant public works or provided direct payments to Athenian citizens. The revolt had not only cost Athens money and lives, but had also deprived the city of resources that rightfully belonged to the imperial power. The initial assembly vote supported Cleon's proposal for mass execution, with a majority of citizens convinced that harsh punishment was necessary to maintain imperial discipline. A trireme was immediately dispatched to the siege commanders with orders to implement the death sentences as soon as possible. However, the extreme nature of the decision created immediate second thoughts among many citizens who had voted for the measure in the heat of emotional rhetoric but now contemplated its practical implications. The following day's assembly meeting, convened at the request of citizens who wished to reconsider the previous decision, featured one of the most significant debates in Athenian democratic history. Diodotus, son of Eucrates, emerged as the primary opponent of Cleon's policy, crafting arguments that challenged both the practical effectiveness and moral justification of mass execution. His speech represented not only a defence of the Mytileneans, but also a broader critique of the increasingly harsh direction of Athenian imperial policy. Diodotus argued that the proposed punishment would actually weaken Athenian imperial control by eliminating the distinction between moderate resistance and total rebellion. If cities knew that any challenge to Athenian authority would result in complete destruction, they would have no incentive to surrender quickly when revolts failed. Instead, they would fight to the death, making future sieges longer and more expensive, while encouraging desperate resistance that would cost additional Athenian lives. The moderate leader also emphasised the practical benefits of preserving Mytilene's population and economic capacity. The city's skilled craftsmen, experienced sailors, and productive agricultural lands represented valuable imperial assets that would be permanently lost through mass execution. A more measured punishment that executed only the revolt's leaders while preserving the general population would maintain these resources while still demonstrating Athenian power and resolve. The debate between Cleon and Diodotus revealed fundamental disagreements about the nature of imperial control and the relationship between fear and loyalty in maintaining political dominance. Cleon represented the view that empires required constant demonstrations of overwhelming force to deter challenges, while Diodotus argued for a more nuanced approach that combined punishment with incentives for cooperation. These competing visions would continue to shape Athenian policy throughout the remaining years of the war. The final vote narrowly favoured Diodotus's position, leading to the immediate dispatch of a second trireme with revised orders that limited executions to approximately 1,000 oligarchic leaders while sparing the general population. The famous race between the two ships, with the second trireme arriving just as the siege commanders were preparing to implement the mass executions, demonstrated both the speed of ancient communications and the dramatic consequences of democratic decision-making during wartime. The actual punishment imposed on Mytilene reflected a compromise between the competing approaches advocated by Cleon and Diodotus. The city's fortifications were demolished and its fleet confiscated, eliminating its capacity for future military resistance. The agricultural land of Lesbos was divided into allotments that were distributed to Athenian citizens, creating a permanent Athenian presence on the island while providing economic benefits to supporters of the imperial system. The surviving Mytilenean population was allowed to remain, but was required to pay rent to the new Athenian landowners, creating a system of economic dependence that ensured continued loyalty. This settlement established precedents that would influence Athenian treatment of rebellious allies throughout the remainder of the war. The combination of limited executions, territorial confiscation, and economic subordination provided a model for maintaining imperial control while preserving the productive capacity of subject cities. However, the harsh terms also demonstrated that Athenian tolerance for disloyalty had significantly decreased since the war's beginning, reflecting the influence of demagogic leadership and popular demands for decisive action. The success of Athenian forces in suppressing the Mytilenean revolt encouraged more aggressive military operations that culminated in the remarkable Pylos campaign of 425 BC. This operation began almost accidentally when an Athenian fleet under Demosthenes was forced to seek shelter from storms at the desolate promontory of Pylos on the western coast of Messenia. The strategic possibilities of this position, which commanded the entrance to the Bay of Navarino and provided access to Helot populations in the Messenian interior, quickly became apparent to the experienced general. Demosthenes had already established a reputation for innovative military tactics through his operations in western Greece, where he had experimented with light-armed troops and unconventional strategies that departed from traditional hoplite warfare. His decision to fortify Pylos reflected this willingness to exploit unexpected opportunities while demonstrating his understanding of Spartan vulnerabilities. The position offered multiple advantages. It provided a secure base for Athenian naval operations in hostile waters. It threatened Spartan communications with their allies in western Greece, and most importantly, it offered sanctuary for runaway helots who might provide intelligence and military assistance. The Spartan response to the Athenian fortification of Pylos revealed both their recognition of the position's strategic importance and their confidence in traditional military methods. King Aegean, who was conducting the annual invasion of Attica, immediately abandoned his campaign and marched his army back to the Peloponnese to deal with this unexpected threat. Simultaneously, the Spartan fleet, which had been positioned at Corcyra to support operations in western Greece, received orders to return immediately to Laconian waters. The Spartan plan for eliminating the Athenian position demonstrated their traditional preference for direct assault over prolonged siege operations. They positioned their land forces on the mainland facing Pylos while deploying their fleet to prevent Athenian naval reinforcement. Most critically, they landed a force of 420 hoplites on the island of Sphacteria, which guarded the southern entrance to the Bay of Navarino, intending to prevent Athenian ships from using the protected anchorage behind the island. This deployment reflected sound tactical thinking based on traditional assumptions about naval warfare, but it failed to account for the superior seamanship and tactical flexibility of Athenian crews. When the main Athenian fleet under Eurymedon arrived to relieve Demosthenes, they achieved complete tactical surprise by attacking the Spartan fleet from multiple directions simultaneously. The Athenian triremes, operating in familiar waters and commanded by experienced officers, systematically destroyed or captured most of the Spartan vessels while suffering minimal losses themselves. The naval battle's outcome created an unprecedented situation that neither side had anticipated. The Spartan hoplites on Sphacteria, originally positioned to support the fleet's operations, now found themselves completely isolated on a barren island with limited food and water supplies. The Athenian fleet controlled the surrounding waters, making resupply impossible while preventing any evacuation of the stranded troops. For the first time in memory, Spartan hoplites faced the prospect of surrender or starvation without the possibility of honourable death in battle. The psychological impact of this situation extended far beyond its immediate military significance. The 420 Spartans trapped on Sphacteria included representatives of some of Sparta's most prominent families, including Spartiatae, whose capture would create unprecedented diplomatic leverage for Athens. Spartan society, organised around concepts of military honour and heroic death in battle, had no precedents for dealing with the potential surrender of elite troops under circumstances that offered no possibility of glorious sacrifice. The Spartan peace overtures that followed demonstrated their willingness to make substantial concessions to secure the release of the trapped soldiers. Spartan ambassadors arrived in Athens with proposals that included ending the war, withdrawing from Attica permanently, and providing guarantees of Athenian security that would have represented major strategic victories for the empire. These negotiations revealed Spartan recognition that the Pylos situation threatened not only the lives of individual soldiers, but also the fundamental prestige that maintained their hegemonic position throughout the Greek world. Cleon's intervention in these peace negotiations demonstrated his understanding of popular psychology and his commitment to maximizing Athenian advantages through aggressive diplomacy. He argued that Spartan desperation created opportunities for extracting concessions that would have been impossible under normal circumstances, and he advocated rejecting the peace offers in favour of demanding additional territorial gains and reparations. His position reflected both genuine strategic calculation and recognition that successful conclusion of the Pylos affair could establish his reputation as Athens' most effective war leader. The demagogue's decision to personally assume command of operations at Sphacteria represented a calculated political risk that demonstrated his confidence in Athenian military superiority. When his critics in the assembly questioned his ability to complete the capture of the Spartan troops, Cleon dramatically accepted full responsibility for the operation, while promising to achieve success within 20 days. This public commitment created enormous pressure for rapid results, while providing Cleon with an opportunity to claim credit for what would become one of Athens' most spectacular military victories. The assault on Sphacteria that followed revealed the effectiveness of innovative tactics that combined traditional hoplite forces with light-armed troops and archers. Demosthenes, who retained operational command while Cleon provided political leadership, had studied the island's terrain carefully and developed a plan that exploited Spartan tactical limitations. The rocky, brush-covered landscape of Sphacteria negated the advantages of heavy armour and close formation fighting that made Spartan hoplites nearly invincible in conventional battles. The Athenian landing force included 800 hoplites supported by large numbers of light-armed troops drawn from allied cities throughout the empire. These peltasts and archers, experienced in irregular warfare and comfortable fighting in broken terrain, could harass the Spartan formation while remaining beyond the reach of their bronze-tipped spears. The psychological effect of this constant harassment, combined with the physical exhaustion caused by wearing heavy armour in summer heat without adequate water, gradually broke down Spartan resistance. The final surrender of 292 surviving Spartans marked an unprecedented moment in Greek military history. Never before had Spartan hoplites laid down their arms and accepted captivity rather than fighting to the death. The prisoners included 120 actual Spartiatai, members of the citizen elite whose capture provided Athens with diplomatic leverage that would influence the war's course for years to come. The psychological impact of this surrender reverberated throughout the Greek world, challenging fundamental assumptions about Spartan military invincibility and encouraging Athens' allies while demoralizing Spartan supporters. Cleon's triumph at Pylos established his position as Athens' dominant political figure, while validating his aggressive approach to military strategy. The demagogue had successfully combined popular appeal with genuine military achievement, demonstrating that democratic leadership could produce results that matched or exceeded those of traditional aristocratic commanders. His success encouraged similar politicians throughout the Greek world while contributing to the broader democratization of political leadership that characterized this period. However, the very qualities that made Cleon effective in domestic politics and siege warfare would prove less suitable for the complex diplomatic and strategic challenges that emerged as the war evolved. His confidence in Athenian military superiority and his contempt for compromise solutions would eventually lead to overextension and strategic miscalculations that would cost Athens dearly. The Spartan response to their humiliation at Pylos would take the form of a brilliant campaign in northern Greece that would ultimately claim both Cleon's life and Athens' most important ally in the region. Brasidas, the Spartan commander who emerged as Cleon's primary antagonist, represented everything that traditional Spartan military culture valued most highly. Unlike the cautious kings who had directed Spartan strategy during the war's early years, Brasidas combined personal courage with strategic innovation and diplomatic skill that enabled him to achieve remarkable success despite limited resources. His appointment to command operations in Thrace reflected Spartan recognition that conventional strategies had failed to achieve decisive results and that new approaches were necessary to counter Athenian advantages. The Spartan decision to open a northern front represented a fundamental shift in strategic thinking that acknowledged the limitations of traditional invasion tactics while exploiting Athenian vulnerabilities in distant territories. Thrace offered multiple advantages for Spartan operations. The region contained numerous cities that chafed under Athenian imperial control. The terrain favoured land-based forces over naval operations, and most importantly, the area included Amphipolis, whose timber resources and strategic position made it one of Athens' most valuable possessions. Brasidas' march north with a force of 1,700 hoplites demonstrated Spartan willingness to take unprecedented risks to achieve strategic objectives. The expedition required passage through hostile or neutral territory, coordination with local allies whose loyalty remained uncertain, and sustained operations far from any possibility of reinforcement or resupply from the Peloponnese. The success of this venture would depend entirely on Brasidas' ability to inspire local populations to revolt against Athenian control while defeating any imperial forces that might be dispatched to restore order. The death of Brasidas at Amphipolis in 422 BC, occurring on the same battlefield that claimed Cleon's life, removed the two most aggressive advocates of continued warfare from their respective cities and created unprecedented opportunities for diplomatic resolution. The mutual exhaustion of both Athens and Sparta after a decade of inconclusive fighting had drained treasuries, decimated populations, and demonstrated the limitations of each side's strategic advantages. The Spartan assembly, faced with the ongoing humiliation of their captured citizens held in Athenian prisons and the persistent threat of Helot rebellion encouraged by Athenian operations at Pylos, found itself increasingly receptive to peace negotiations that might restore their traditional prestige while securing the return of their hostages. Nicias, son of Niceratus, emerged as the primary architect of Athenian peace policy during this crucial period. Unlike Cleon, whose political success had depended on appealing to popular emotions and promising quick military victories, Nicias represented the conservative property-owning classes whose wealth had been steadily eroded by the costs of prolonged warfare. His extensive silver mining operations in Laurium had provided him with enormous personal fortune, but the disruption of trade routes and the expense of maintaining large military forces had reduced the profitability of such enterprises while creating pressure for more sustainable policies. The Athenian general's approach to diplomacy reflected both genuine strategic calculation and personal religious convictions that made him deeply suspicious of aggressive military adventures. Nicias had witnessed the devastating consequences of overconfidence during the Sicilian expedition's planning phases, and his natural caution led him to prefer negotiated settlements that preserved Athenian gains while avoiding the risks inherent in continued expansion. His reputation for personal piety and careful military preparation had earned him respect among conservative citizens who valued stability over the dramatic but unpredictable successes promised by demagogic leaders. The preliminary negotiations that began in late 422 BC revealed the complexity of achieving lasting peace between powers whose fundamental interests remained incompatible despite their mutual exhaustion. The Spartan delegation, led by experienced diplomats who understood Athenian political culture, focused their initial proposals on prisoner exchanges and territorial adjustments that would address immediate grievances while leaving broader questions of imperial control for future resolution. They recognized that Athenian democracy required tangible benefits that could be presented to the assembly as victories justifying the sacrifices of the previous decade. The most contentious issue involved the status of Amphipolis, whose capture by Brasidas had eliminated one of Athens' most valuable imperial possessions, while demonstrating Spartan ability to threaten Athenian interests far from traditional theatres of operation. The city's timber resources, essential for maintaining Athens' naval supremacy, made its recovery a fundamental Athenian demand, while its strategic position controlling access to Thracian gold mines gave it enormous economic significance that neither side could readily abandon. The Spartans, however, faced the practical difficulty that Amphipolis had declared its independence and showed no inclination to accept renewed Athenian control. The territorial provisions ultimately incorporated into the Peace of Nicias reflected compromises that satisfied neither side's maximum objectives while providing sufficient benefits to justify ratification by their respective assemblies. Athens would recover Pylos and the strategic island of Cythera, eliminating the Spartan bases that had threatened Helot loyalty and provided platforms for attacks on Athenian commerce. In return, Sparta would regain Nicaea and several other positions captured during Athenian raids, while both sides agreed to restore all other conquered territories to their pre-war status. The prisoner exchange arrangements demonstrated the particular importance that Spartan society placed on recovering their captured citizens, whose continued imprisonment represented an unprecedented challenge to traditional concepts of military honour. The 292 Spartans taken at Sphacteria, including 120 full citizens whose families represented the core of Spartan political leadership, had become powerful symbols of Athenian military success and diplomatic leverage. Their release required corresponding Athenian concessions, including the return of all Spartan prisoners taken during various campaigns and guarantees that Pylos would not be used as a base for encouraging further Helot rebellions. The 50-year alliance provision represented the most ambitious aspect of the peace settlement, establishing a framework for long-term cooperation that went far beyond simple cessation of hostilities. This defensive pact obligated each power to assist the other against external threats, while creating mechanisms for resolving future disputes through arbitration rather than warfare. The alliance reflected recognition by moderate leaders in both cities that their fundamental interests were not necessarily incompatible, and that cooperation might serve their mutual benefit against emerging challenges from other powers. The religious dimensions of the peace treaty reflected the central role that divine sanction played in ancient diplomatic arrangements. Both sides swore elaborate oaths invoking the major gods of their respective pantheons, while establishing procedures for regular sacrificial ceremonies that would maintain divine favour for the agreement. The treaty specified particular temples where these rituals would occur and designated specific officials responsible for ensuring that religious obligations were properly fulfilled. Violations of the peace would thus constitute not only political breaches, but also acts of sacrilege that would invite divine punishment. However, the ratification process in both cities revealed significant opposition that would undermine the treaty's effectiveness from its inception. In Sparta, the ephors faced criticism from allies who felt betrayed by the separate peace with Athens and from military commanders who argued that continued warfare offered better prospects for achieving decisive victory. The Corinthians, in particular, expressed outrage at provisions that failed to address their specific grievances against Athenian commercial policies and left their colonial interests vulnerable to continued imperial pressure. The Athenian Assembly's debate over ratification demonstrated the persistent influence of aggressive factions that viewed the peace terms as inadequate compensation for Athens' military sacrifices and imperial investments. Critics pointed out that the treaty failed to secure Amphipolis or address the fundamental issue of Spartan interference with Athenian allies, while providing Sparta with significant benefits, including the return of prestigious prisoners and the elimination of threats to their domestic security. These objections reflected broader concerns about whether negotiated settlements could preserve Athenian imperial dominance or whether continued military pressure offered better prospects for achieving maximum objectives. The implementation of the peace treaty's provisions revealed immediate difficulties that demonstrated the inadequacy of formal agreements to resolve fundamental political conflicts. The restoration of captured territories proceeded slowly and incompletely, with local populations often resisting transfers that had been negotiated by distant governments without consultation of their preferences. Amphipolis, despite Spartan promises to facilitate its return to Athenian control, maintained its independence with tacit Spartan support, while several other cities claimed that changed circumstances made literal compliance with treaty terms impossible or inappropriate. The formation of the alternative alliance system that emerged in 420 BC represented the most serious challenge to the Peace of Nicias, and demonstrated how quickly the fragile diplomatic settlement could unravel under pressure from dissatisfied parties. Argos, which had remained neutral during the Archidamian War while rebuilding its military strength, emerged as the leader of a coalition that offered an alternative to the bipolar system dominated by Athens and Sparta. The Argive proposal for a new alliance attracted support from cities that felt marginalised by the peace settlement and sought greater independence from the major powers. The Argive alliance initially included Mantinea and Elis, both of which had specific grievances against Spartan policies that the Peace of Nicias had failed to address. Mantinea resented Spartan interference in Arcadian affairs and sought greater autonomy for the region's traditional democratic institutions, while Elis objected to Spartan violations of Olympic neutrality and demanded recognition of their special religious prerogatives. These cities viewed the Argive coalition as an opportunity to balance Spartan power while maintaining their independence from both major imperial systems. The Athenian decision to join this alliance represented a dramatic departure from the moderate policies that Nicias had advocated and reflected the growing influence of Alcibiades in Athenian political life. The young politician, whose family connections and personal charisma had already established him as a rising force in democratic politics, argued that the Argive alliance offered Athens opportunities to expand its influence in the Peloponnese while undermining Spartan hegemony through diplomatic rather than military means. His advocacy for this policy demonstrated both his strategic vision and his willingness to take risks that more conservative leaders would avoid. Alcibiades' rise to prominence occurred during a period when Athenian democracy was experiencing significant generational change. As older leaders who had guided the city through the Persian Wars and early imperial expansion gave way to younger politicians whose political consciousness had been shaped by the Peloponnesian conflict. Born around 450 BC, Alcibiades belonged to one of Athens' most distinguished families and had received the finest education available, including personal instruction from Socrates that had developed his intellectual capabilities while apparently failing to instill corresponding moral restraint. The young aristocrat's physical appearance and personal style contributed significantly to his political appeal and public notoriety. Contemporary sources describe him as exceptionally handsome, with the kind of striking features and athletic build that Greeks associated with divine favour and heroic potential. His clothing and personal accessories reflected expensive tastes and deliberate ostentation designed to demonstrate his superiority to ordinary citizens, while his public behaviour combined aristocratic arrogance with democratic accessibility in ways that both attracted and scandalised Athenian society. Alcibiades' military service during the later phases of the Archidamian War had demonstrated both his personal courage and his capacity for innovative tactical thinking. His performance at the Battle of Potidaea, where he had distinguished himself despite his youth and inexperience, established his reputation for physical bravery while revealing his ambition for military glory. However, his subsequent actions also displayed a troubling tendency toward reckless decision-making and disregard for established authority that would characterise his entire career. The political alliance between Alcibiades and the Argive coalition reflected his understanding of democratic politics and his recognition that dramatic policy initiatives could establish his leadership credentials while appealing to popular desires for renewed imperial expansion. The young politician argued that the Peace of Nicias had been premature and inadequate, failing to secure Athens' legitimate imperial interests while providing Sparta with undeserved benefits. The Argive alliance offered opportunities to correct these deficiencies through diplomatic manoeuvring that would isolate Sparta and create new possibilities for Athenian expansion. The negotiation of Athens' alliance with Argos, Mantinea and Elis required careful diplomatic management to avoid providing Sparta with legitimate grounds for claiming that Athens had violated the peace treaty. Alcibiades crafted the alliance terms to emphasise their defensive character while creating mechanisms for coordinated military action that would effectively challenge Spartan hegemony throughout the Peloponnese. The agreement established mutual defence obligations that would require Athenian military support if any alliance member faced Spartan attack, while providing Athens with strategic bases and allied forces for future operations. The Spartan response to this diplomatic revolution demonstrated their recognition that the new alliance system threatened their fundamental interests, while revealing the limitations of their traditional diplomatic methods. King Aegean, who had assumed primary responsibility for Spartan foreign policy following his father's death, attempted to counter the Argive coalition through direct military intervention that would demonstrate Spartan power, while punishing cities that had challenged their hegemony. However, the military campaign that followed revealed both the continued effectiveness of Spartan hoplite forces and the political complexities of maintaining imperial control through military intimidation. The march of the Spartan army toward Argive territory in summer 418 BC represented the largest military mobilization since the early years of the Peloponnesian War, with contingents drawn from throughout the Peloponnesian League demonstrating continued loyalty to Spartan leadership, despite the diplomatic challenges posed by the rival alliance system. The army included not only the full Spartan citizen levy, but also substantial forces from Corinth, Megara, and other allied cities, whose participation demonstrated their continued commitment to Spartan hegemony, despite their dissatisfaction with specific policies. The Battle of Mantinea that climaxed this campaign provided a decisive test of the competing alliance systems, while demonstrating the continued superiority of traditional Spartan military methods when properly applied under favourable circumstances. The engagement occurred on the plain south of Mantinea, where the relatively open terrain favoured hoplite formations and minimised the tactical advantages that light-armed troops had enjoyed in more broken country. The Spartan army, numbering approximately 9,000 hoplites supported by cavalry and light troops, faced a coalition force of similar size that included contingents from all four allied cities. The battle's initial deployment reflected the tactical expertise that made Spartan commanders among the most respected military leaders in the Greek world. King Aegean positioned his forces with the Spartan contingent holding the traditional place of honour on the right wing, while allied troops occupied the centre and left portions of the line. The opposing coalition arranged their forces with the Mantineans on their right wing facing the Spartans directly, while Argive hoplites held the centre, and Athenian forces under Laches and Nicostratus occupied the left wing opposite the Spartan allies. The engagement that followed demonstrated both the effectiveness of Spartan military training and the continued relevance of traditional hoplite tactics when employed by disciplined troops under experienced leadership. The Spartan advance proceeded with the measured pace and perfect alignment that had made their phalanx formation legendary throughout the Greek world, while their bronze-faced shields and crimson cloaks created a visual spectacle that intimidated opponents even before physical contact occurred. The rhythmic chanting of paeans and the steady beat of flutes that accompanied their advance added psychological pressure that often broke enemy formations before actual combat began. The collision between the opposing phalanxes occurred with the tremendous crash of bronze against bronze that characterised hoplite warfare, as hundreds of spear points struck shields and armour while the rear ranks pressed forward to maintain momentum. The Spartans' superior training and conditioning quickly became apparent as they maintained their formation integrity while systematically pushing back their opponents through coordinated pressure applied at precisely the right moments. The Mantineans, despite their reputation for military effectiveness, found themselves unable to match the disciplined advance of troops whose entire social system was organised around military excellence. The collapse of the coalition's right wing created a cascade effect that spread panic throughout their entire formation, as soldiers observed their supposedly strongest contingent being systematically destroyed by Spartan pressure. The Argive centre, already under severe pressure from Spartan allied forces, began falling back in disorder when news spread that the Mantineans were in full retreat. The Athenian contingent positioned on the coalition's left wing found itself increasingly isolated as the remainder of the allied army disintegrated around them. The pursuit that followed the coalition army's collapse demonstrated Spartan tactical discipline and strategic understanding as they systematically eliminated enemy resistance, while avoiding the kind of reckless chase that might have exposed them to counterattack. The Spartan forces maintained their formation integrity, even during the pursuit phase, ensuring that scattered enemy troops could not rally while preventing their own forces from becoming dispersed and vulnerable. The systematic nature of this pursuit maximised enemy casualties while minimising Spartan losses, achieving the kind of decisive victory that would restore their military reputation throughout the Greek world. The casualties from the Battle of Mantinea reflected the engagement's decisive character and demonstrated the effectiveness of traditional military methods when properly applied under favourable circumstances. The coalition forces lost approximately 1,100 men killed, including many of their most experienced officers and political leaders, while Spartan losses totalled fewer than 300 casualties. This favourable ratio reflected not only superior tactical performance, but also the psychological impact of Spartan military reputation, which had encouraged many enemy troops to flee rather than face certain death in hopeless combat. The political consequences of Mantinea extended far beyond its immediate military results, fundamentally altering the balance of power throughout the Peloponnese, while restoring Spartan confidence in their traditional methods and leadership. The destruction of the Argive coalition eliminated the most serious challenge to Spartan hegemony since the Persian Wars, while demonstrating that military excellence remained the ultimate arbiter of political disputes despite the diplomatic innovations of the previous decade. The victory validated conservative Spartan policies while discrediting the more aggressive approaches that had characterized the war's middle phases. The restoration of Spartan prestige following Mantinea encouraged their allies throughout the Greek world, while correspondingly undermining the confidence of cities that had considered challenging established power relationships. The Corinthians, who had provided substantial forces for the campaign, found their loyalty to the Peloponnesian League reinforced by participation in such a decisive victory, while other allied cities recognised that Spartan military capabilities remained formidable despite their diplomatic setbacks during the previous decade. For Athens, the defeat at Mantinea represented both a military disaster and a diplomatic humiliation that undermined the aggressive policies advocated by Alcibiades, while vindicating Nicias' preference for cautious defensive strategies. The loss of Athenian prestige in the Peloponnese eliminated opportunities for further expansion in that region, while demonstrating the continued risks inherent in challenging Spartan power through direct military confrontation. The young Alcibiades, whose advocacy for the Argive alliance had contributed directly to this disaster, found his political position weakened despite his skill in deflecting personal responsibility for the defeat. However, rather than moderating his ambitions in response to this setback, Alcibiades began advocating for even more dramatic military adventures that would restore Athenian prestige while providing opportunities for the kind of spectacular success that could establish his dominance in democratic politics. His attention turned increasingly towards Sicily, where the complex political situation among Greek cities offered possibilities for intervention that might achieve the decisive victories that had proven elusive in conventional theatres of operation. The seeds of Athens' greatest disaster were thus planted in the aftermath of their defeat at Mantinea, as frustrated ambitions sought outlet through increasingly reckless strategic gambles. The diplomatic humiliation at Mantinea had scarcely faded from Athenian memory when an unexpected embassy arrived from the distant Sicilian city of Segesta in winter 416-415 BC, bearing appeals for military assistance that would ultimately lead Athens into the most catastrophic adventure in its imperial history. The Segestans, locked in a territorial dispute with their neighbour Selinus over boundary lands and marriage rights, had initially sought support from their traditional allies in mainland Greece, but found little enthusiasm for intervention in what appeared to be a minor local conflict. Their decision to approach Athens reflected both desperation and shrewd calculation about Athenian imperial ambitions and democratic susceptibility to grandiose military projects. The Segestan ambassadors who addressed the Athenian assembly presented their case with considerable diplomatic skill, emphasising not only their immediate need for assistance, but also the broader opportunities that Sicilian intervention might provide for Athenian imperial expansion. They described Sicily as a wealthy island whose Greek cities possessed extensive resources and strategic positions that could serve as stepping stones toward further expansion into the Western Mediterranean. More provocatively, they hinted that Syracuse, the largest and most powerful Sicilian city, harboured ambitions to dominate the entire island and might eventually threaten Athenian interests in southern Italy if allowed to consolidate its regional hegemony unchallenged. The initial Athenian response to these overtures reflected the cautious approach that had characterised democratic decision-making since the Peace of Nicias, with the assembly authorising a modest fact-finding mission rather than immediate military commitment. A delegation of 3 experienced diplomats received instructions to investigate Segestan claims about their financial resources and military capabilities while assessing the broader political situation throughout Sicily. This measured approach satisfied conservative citizens who remained suspicious of foreign entanglements, while providing advocates of intervention with opportunities to gather intelligence that might support more ambitious proposals. The return of the Athenian envoys in spring 415 BC created a sensation that transformed the political atmosphere and made large-scale military intervention appear both feasible and profitable. The diplomats reported that Segestan temples contained enormous quantities of gold and silver vessels that demonstrated the city's capacity to finance substantial military operations, while describing the island's agricultural wealth and commercial potential in terms that excited popular imagination. Their accounts of Syracuse's growing power and alleged hostility toward Athens provided strategic justification for preemptive action, while their descriptions of potential Allied support from other Sicilian cities suggested that intervention might achieve decisive results with relatively modest effort. These optimistic assessments, however, concealed fundamental misunderstandings about Sicilian political realities and Segestan financial capabilities that would prove catastrophic once military operations began. The impressive temple treasures that had so impressed the Athenian envoys consisted largely of borrowed items that Segestan officials had gathered from throughout their territory to create an illusion of wealth, while the city's actual resources were insufficient to support the kind of extended military campaign that would be necessary to achieve meaningful results. More significantly, the complex web of alliances and rivalries among Sicilian cities made it unlikely that any external intervention could achieve quick success without becoming entangled in prolonged local conflicts. The assembly debate that followed the envoy's report revealed the extent to which Athenian political culture had been transformed by decades of imperial expansion and democratic competition for popular favour. Nicias, now in his 60s and increasingly concerned about the risks of overextension, attempted to moderate the popular enthusiasm by emphasising the enormous costs and uncertain benefits of Sicilian intervention. He pointed out that Athens already faced significant challenges in maintaining control over its existing empire, while managing ongoing tensions with Sparta, making it imprudent to undertake new commitments that might strain imperial resources beyond their capacity. The conservative leader's arguments reflected both genuine strategic concerns and personal religious convictions that made him deeply suspicious of ambitious military ventures that seemed to invite divine retribution for excessive hubris. Nicias had observed the devastating consequences of the plague and other disasters that had befallen Athens during periods of aggressive expansion, and he interpreted these events as warnings against pursuing objectives that exceeded proper human limitations. His natural caution reinforced by personal piety and advancing age, led him to advocate policies that would preserve existing Athenian advantages while avoiding the risks inherent in dramatic new initiatives. Alcibiades, however, seized upon the Sicilian opportunity as exactly the kind of spectacular project that could restore his political fortunes, while providing Athens with the decisive victory that had proven elusive in conventional theatres of operation. The young aristocrat's speech to the assembly, as recorded by Thucydides, revealed both his strategic vision and his understanding of popular psychology during a period when democratic institutions rewarded leaders who promised dramatic results rather than cautious management of existing resources. He argued that Athenian imperial power depended on constant expansion, and that any pause in aggressive action would encourage challenges from existing enemies while disappointing allies who expected tangible benefits from their association with Athens. The ambitious politician's advocacy for Sicilian intervention reflected his recognition that democratic politics required continuous demonstration of success through increasingly impressive achievements. He understood that the Athenian citizenry, having experienced the costs and sacrifices of prolonged warfare, demanded compensating benefits that could justify their continued support for imperial policies. The conquest of Sicily, with its legendary wealth and strategic position controlling access to the Western Mediterranean, offered possibilities for the kind of transformative success that could establish his reputation as Athens' greatest leader, while providing resources for even more ambitious future projects. Alcibiades also appealed to popular fears about Syracusan power and intentions, arguing that the large Sicilian city's growing influence represented a potential threat that would be better addressed through preemptive action rather than defensive response to future aggression. He claimed that Syracuse had already begun coordinating with Sparta and other Athenian enemies, making intervention a matter of imperial security rather than mere opportunistic expansion. These arguments, while containing elements of truth about Syracusan ambitions, significantly exaggerated both the immediacy of the threat and the likelihood that military intervention could eliminate it effectively. The final assembly vote authorised an expedition of unprecedented scale that reflected both popular enthusiasm for the project and democratic tendency to support ambitious proposals once initial commitments had been made. The force approved for Sicilian operations included 60 triremes with full crews, 5,100 hoplites drawn from both citizens and allied contingents, and substantial numbers of light-armed troops, archers, and cavalry that would provide tactical flexibility in unfamiliar terrain. The financial allocation exceeded 1,000 talents, representing one of the largest single military expenditures in Athenian history, and demonstrating the empire's confidence in its capacity to achieve decisive results through overwhelming force. The appointment of joint commanders for this massive expedition reflected both democratic preference for shared leadership and recognition that the operation's complexity required diverse skills and experience. Nicias received command despite his opposition to the entire project, reflecting popular respect for his military competence, and perhaps hope that his caution might prevent the kind of reckless decisions that had characterized some previous campaigns. Alcibiades' appointment acknowledged his role in advocating the expedition, while providing him with opportunities to demonstrate his strategic vision through practical results. The selection of Lamachus as the third commander added experienced military leadership from an officer whose entire career had been devoted to professional warfare rather than political advancement. The preparations for departure revealed both the expedition's impressive scale and the underlying tensions that would plague its operations from the beginning. The harbour at Piraeus became a scene of intense activity as shipwrights completed final modifications to triremes, while supply officers coordinated the complex logistics required to maintain such a large force across vast distances. The sight of 134 triremes prepared for simultaneous departure created enormous excitement among citizens who viewed the fleet as visible proof of Athenian power and imperial destiny, while the elaborate religious ceremonies that preceded the sailing reflected popular hopes for divine favour in the coming campaign. However, The mutilation of the Hermae that occurred on a single night shortly before the fleet's scheduled departure created a scandal that would ultimately prove more destructive to Athenian interests than any military defeat. The systematic defacement of these sacred statues, which stood at street corners and outside private houses throughout Athens, represented an act of unprecedented sacrilege that shocked the entire citizenry while raising fears about conspiracies against democratic institutions. The Hermes served not only religious functions as protective symbols dedicated to Hermes, but also civic purposes as markers of Athenian identity and community solidarity, making their mutilation an attack on the fundamental symbols of democratic culture. The investigation that followed revealed the depth of popular anxiety about aristocratic conspiracies and religious subversion that had been building throughout the war years as traditional social relationships came under increasing strain. The Assembly authorised extraordinary powers for officials investigating the sacrilege, including rewards for informants and guarantees of immunity for those providing information about the perpetrators. The atmosphere of suspicion and denunciation that resulted transformed Athens into a city where neighbours viewed each other with distrust, while political enemies exploited religious fears for partisan advantage. Alcibiades found himself at the centre of these investigations when informants alleged his involvement in both the Hermae mutilation and separate incidents involving the profanation of the Eleusinian mysteries at private drinking parties. These charges reflected both genuine evidence of his participation in aristocratic religious violations and political calculation by enemies who recognised that scandal might eliminate their most dangerous rival. The young politician's lifestyle, which had always included behaviour that conventional citizens found shocking, now became the focus of public attention as prosecutors argued that his personal conduct revealed contempt for democratic values and religious obligations. The political crisis created by these investigations placed the Sicilian expedition in jeopardy just as final preparations were reaching completion. Alcibiades demanded an immediate trial that would either clear his name or remove him from command before the fleet departed, arguing that accusations should be resolved quickly rather than left to fester during his absence from Athens. His supporters in the Assembly initially endorsed this approach, recognising that unresolved charges would undermine his authority while providing enemies with opportunities to pursue prosecution without effective defence. However, Alcibiades' political opponents, led by figures who had opposed the Sicilian expedition from its inception, calculated that delay would serve their interests better than immediate resolution. They argued that the urgency of military preparations made it impossible to conduct proper investigations before the fleet's departure, while suggesting that the expedition's success should not be endangered by domestic political disputes. This position, while ostensibly reasonable, actually reflected their understanding that Alcibiades' absence would provide opportunities for gathering additional evidence and building stronger cases against him. The compromise that emerged from these debates satisfied no one while creating conditions that would ultimately prove disastrous for both Alcibiades and the expedition itself. The Assembly voted to allow the fleet to depart on schedule with Alcibiades retaining his command, but with the understanding that he would return to face trial once initial operations had been completed and his military responsibilities could be transferred to his colleagues. This arrangement preserved the expedition's leadership structure while maintaining the appearance of taking religious charges seriously, but it also ensured that the scandal would continue to fester and potentially explode at the worst possible moment. The fleet's departure from Piraeus in June 415 BC created a spectacle that impressed even citizens accustomed to impressive displays of Athenian naval power. The 134 triremes departed in organised formations that demonstrated both tactical discipline and ceremonial magnificence, with their bronze-reinforced rams gleaming in the morning sun, while their crews sang paeans celebrating Athenian glory and imperial destiny. The sight of so many vessels moving in coordinated precision across the waters of the Saronic Gulf provided visible evidence of the empire's military capabilities, while inspiring confidence that such overwhelming force could achieve any objective that democratic will might establish. The expedition's first major stop at Corcyra revealed both the logistical complexity of maintaining such a large force and the political challenges that would complicate all subsequent operations. The Corcyraeans, despite their alliance with Athens, proved reluctant to provide the extensive support that the expedition required, citing their own security concerns and limited resources. Their cautious response reflected broader patterns of allied behaviour throughout the empire, where subject cities calculated their obligations carefully while avoiding commitments that might prove costly or dangerous if Athenian fortunes declined. The intelligence gathering that occurred during the Corcyraean stopover provided the first accurate assessments of Sicilian political realities and revealed the extent to which initial Athenian assumptions had been based on incomplete or misleading information. Local informants reported that Segistan financial resources were far more limited than their ambassadors had claimed, while describing a complex network of alliances and rivalries among Sicilian cities that would make it difficult for any external force to achieve quick, decisive results. Most significantly, they confirmed that Syracuse possessed substantial military capabilities and had already begun coordinating defensive preparations with other cities that viewed Athenian intervention as a threat to their independence. The expedition's arrival at Rhegium in southern Italy marked the beginning of serious military operations, while revealing the fundamental strategic disagreements among the three Athenian commanders. Nicias advocated a limited intervention focused on providing immediate assistance to Segesta, while demonstrating Athenian power through naval displays that might encourage favourable diplomatic settlements. His approach reflected both his natural caution and his recognition that the expedition's resources, while impressive, were insufficient for conquering and holding large territories against determined resistance. Alcibiades proposed a more aggressive strategy that would exploit Sicilian political divisions through diplomatic manoeuvring designed to isolate Syracuse, while building a coalition of allied cities that could provide local support for Athenian operations. He argued that military success depended on understanding and manipulating existing rivalries rather than relying solely on superior force, and he advocated extensive negotiations with potential allies before committing to major combat operations. His approach demonstrated both strategic sophistication and recognition that lasting success would require political as well as military victories. Lamachus, the most experienced military professional among the three commanders, advocated immediate attack on Syracuse itself, arguing that the city's defences were not yet fully prepared and that surprise assault might achieve decisive results before enemy forces could be properly organised. His proposal reflected traditional military thinking that emphasised the advantages of rapid action and concentrated force, while recognising that prolonged campaigns would allow enemies to strengthen their positions while straining Athenian logistics and morale. The inability of the three commanders to reach agreement on basic strategic objectives revealed fundamental flaws in the expedition's organisation that would plague all subsequent operations. The democratic principle of shared leadership, while politically necessary given the commanders' different constituencies and qualifications, proved inadequate for managing complex military operations that required rapid decision-making and coordinated action. The resulting compromises satisfied none of the competing strategic visions, while ensuring that the expedition would pursue inconsistent policies that maximised disadvantages while failing to exploit potential advantages. The recall of Alcibiades that occurred just as serious military operations were beginning eliminated the expedition's most innovative strategic thinker, while creating a political crisis that would have devastating consequences for both the campaign and Athenian domestic politics. The state trireme Salaminia arrived at Catana with orders for Alcibiades to return immediately to face charges related to the Hermae mutilation and religious profanation, reflecting the Assembly's decision that the scandals required resolution, regardless of their impact on military operations. The timing of this recall, occurring precisely when the expedition needed unified leadership and clear strategic direction, demonstrated the destructive potential of democratic decision-making during periods of political crisis. Alcibiades' response to the recall order revealed both his political acumen and his fundamental lack of loyalty to democratic institutions, when they conflicted with his personal interests. Rather than returning to Athens to face charges that might result in exile or death, he chose to flee to Sparta, where his intimate knowledge of Athenian strategic planning and military capabilities would provide enormous advantages to Athens' primary enemy. His defection represented not only personal betrayal, but also strategic catastrophe, as he possessed detailed information about the expedition's objectives, resources, and weaknesses that would enable Spartan countermeasures. The strategic advice that Alcibiades provided to the Spartan assembly demonstrated both his thorough understanding of Athenian vulnerabilities and his willingness to damage his native city's interests in pursuit of personal revenge. He urged the Spartans to send immediate military assistance to Syracuse, arguing that Athenian success in Sicily would provide resources and strategic positions for further expansion that would ultimately threaten Spartan interests throughout the Mediterranean. More devastatingly, he recommended that Sparta establish a permanent fortified base at Deceleia in northern Attica, a position that would enable year-round pressure on Athenian territory while disrupting the agricultural and mining activities that provided essential imperial revenues. The implementation of Alcibiades' strategic recommendations would prove catastrophic for Athens, but their immediate impact on the Sicilian expedition was equally destructive, as Spartan assistance enabled Syracusan resistance, while eliminating any possibility of achieving quick decisive results through surprise or superior force. The arrival of the Spartan commander Gylippus at Syracuse in 414 BC provided the Sicilian city with experienced military leadership and tactical expertise that would prove crucial in subsequent operations. While Spartan financial support enabled the construction of additional fortifications and the recruitment of mercenary forces from throughout the region, the siege of Syracuse that dominated the expedition's final phase revealed both the impressive capabilities of Athenian military engineering and the ultimate inadequacy of even superior force when applied without clear strategic vision or adequate resources. The Athenians established elaborate siege works that demonstrated their mastery of advanced military techniques, including cross walls designed to isolate the city from external support and sophisticated naval installations that controlled access to Syracuse's great harbour. These fortifications represented remarkable achievements of military engineering that showcased Athenian technical capabilities while providing effective tactical advantages during the siege's initial phases. However, the sheer scale of the siege operation strained Athenian resources while revealing the expedition's fundamental logistical vulnerabilities. The maintenance of extensive siege works required enormous quantities of materials and labour that had to be transported across vast distances, while the need to guard against external relief efforts dispersed Athenian forces across multiple positions that could not provide mutual support. The arrival of Gylippus with Spartan reinforcements exploited these vulnerabilities by coordinating external attacks with Syracusan sorties that gradually eroded Athenian positions, while inflicting casualties that could not be replaced. The naval battles in Syracuse's great harbour marked the beginning of the expedition's final collapse as Athenian maritime supremacy, the foundation of all imperial strategy, faced its most serious challenge since the Persian Wars. The confined waters of the harbour negated many traditional advantages of Athenian seamanship, while favouring the heavier construction and ramming tactics that Syracusan shipwrights had developed specifically for these conditions. The systematic modification of Syracusan triremes, including reinforced prows and additional protective timbers, reflected sophisticated understanding of local tactical requirements and demonstrated that technical innovation could overcome even significant disparities in crew experience and training. The decisive naval engagement that sealed the expedition's fate occurred in September 413 BC, when the remaining Athenian fleet, now reduced to fewer than 60 operational triremes, attempted to force passage out of the great harbour while carrying the army's surviving personnel to safety. The Syracusans had prepared for this breakout attempt by positioning their entire fleet across the harbour mouth, while constructing underwater obstacles that would channel Athenian ships into predetermined killing zones. The battle that followed demonstrated both the desperation of Athenian efforts and the effectiveness of Syracusan defensive preparations as superior numbers and favourable positioning overcame Athenian tactical superiority. The destruction of the Athenian fleet in the Great Harbour eliminated any possibility of evacuation by sea and forced the surviving army to attempt escape overland through hostile territory where every advantage favoured their enemies. The retreat that followed represented one of the most catastrophic military disasters in Greek history, as approximately 40,000 Athenians and allied troops began a march toward friendly territory while harassed by cavalry, light troops, and local populations who viewed them as invaders deserving no mercy. The psychological impact of naval defeat had already demoralised the army, while inadequate supplies and constant attacks gradually reduced their numbers and effectiveness. The final surrender of Athenian forces at the Acinarus River marked the complete destruction of the most ambitious military expedition in Athenian history and eliminated nearly 1/3 of the empire's total military manpower in a single catastrophic defeat. The survivors, numbering perhaps 7,000 men, faced imprisonment in Syracuse's stone quarries under conditions that would prove fatal for most within months of their capture. The execution of Nicias and Demosthenes, despite Gylippus's attempts to preserve them as valuable prisoners, reflected Syracusan determination to demonstrate their complete victory while eliminating leaders who might organise future resistance or escape attempts. The strategic consequences of the Sicilian disaster extended far beyond its immediate military impact, fundamentally altering the balance of power throughout the Greek world while encouraging challenges to Athenian imperial control that would ultimately prove fatal to the empire itself. The loss of so many experienced troops, naval crews, and military commanders eliminated much of the professional expertise that had enabled Athenian military success, while the enormous financial costs of the expedition exhausted imperial reserves and forced increased tribute demands that provoked widespread resentment among allied cities. Most significantly, the demonstration of Athenian vulnerability encouraged both existing enemies and previously neutral powers to view the empire as a declining force whose defeat had become not only possible but probable. The catastrophic destruction of the Sicilian expedition transformed the strategic landscape of the Greek world more dramatically than any single event since Xerxes' invasion 70 years earlier. News of the disaster reached Athens in autumn 413 BC through a series of increasingly desperate messages that chronicled the expedition's final collapse, creating shockwaves that reverberated through every level of Athenian society. The initial reports, delivered by surviving sailors who had escaped Syracuse's harbour aboard damaged vessels, seemed so incredible that many citizens refused to believe them until official confirmation arrived from the few officers who had managed to reach friendly territory in southern Italy. The immediate impact on Athenian morale proved even more devastating than the material losses, as citizens who had witnessed the magnificent fleet's departure 2 years earlier struggled to comprehend how such overwhelming force could have been completely annihilated. The democracy that had enthusiastically endorsed the expedition now faced the consequences of its hubris, with popular assemblies becoming scenes of recrimination and desperate searches for scapegoats who might bear responsibility for the unprecedented disaster. The religious implications seemed equally ominous, as many interpreted the defeat as divine punishment for the sacrilege of the mutilated Hermae, creating an atmosphere of spiritual crisis that compounded the practical challenges facing the empire. The financial devastation exceeded even the human casualties and its long-term implications for Athenian imperial capacity. The expedition had consumed over 2,000 talents in direct costs, while eliminating the tax base represented by thousands of citizens whose property assessments had supported public finances. The loss of experienced triremes, each representing an investment of approximately 1 talent in construction and equipment, eliminated naval assets that would require years to replace even under optimal conditions. More critically, the destruction of trained crews represented the loss of irreplaceable human capital, as the specialized skills required for effective naval warfare could only be developed through years of practical experience that the Empire no longer had time to provide. Sparta's response to news of the Athenian catastrophe revealed both their strategic acumen and their recognition that the balance of power had shifted decisively in their favour for the first time since the war's beginning. The Spartan assembly, guided by Alcibiades' intimate knowledge of Athenian vulnerabilities, immediately authorised the comprehensive strategy that would characterise the conflict's final phase. Rather than simply resuming the seasonal invasions of Attica that had proven ineffective during the Archidamian War, they would implement a coordinated campaign designed to exploit Athenian weakness through simultaneous pressure on multiple fronts. The establishment of the permanent fortified base at Deceleia represented the most innovative aspect of this new Spartan strategy, transforming the traditional pattern of seasonal warfare into year-round pressure that would systematically strangle Athenian economic capacity. The site, located approximately 14 miles north of Athens on the main route connecting the city to its silver mines at Laurium, had been selected through careful reconnaissance that identified its strategic advantages for disrupting Athenian communications and supply lines. The position commanded extensive views across the Attic plain, while providing access to multiple escape routes that would enable the garrison to avoid encirclement if Athenian forces attempted to dislodge them. King Aegean II personally supervised the construction of the Deceleia fortifications during winter 413-412 BC, employing Peloponnesian League engineers who had gained expertise in military construction during previous campaigns. The resulting complex included not only defensive walls and towers designed to withstand siege operations, but also permanent barracks, supply depots, and administrative facilities that would enable sustained occupation regardless of seasonal variations or enemy pressure. The fortress design incorporated lessons learned from Athenian fortification techniques, while adapting them to the specific requirements of maintaining a hostile base deep within enemy territory. The garrison established at Deceleia included carefully selected troops whose experience and reliability made them suitable for the complex challenges of permanent occupation in hostile territory. The core force consisted of 1,500 Spartan Perioeci and allied hoplites, commanded by experienced officers who understood both conventional warfare and the irregular tactics required for successful raiding operations. These troops were supported by substantial numbers of helots, who provided essential services while being kept under strict supervision to prevent defection to Athenian forces that might offer them freedom in exchange for intelligence or military service. The immediate impact of the Deceleia occupation exceeded even Spartan expectations, as the fortress effectively severed Athens' land communications with northern Attica and eliminated access to the Laurium silver mines that had provided crucial imperial revenues. Athenian farmers throughout the region abandoned their properties rather than face constant raids, while merchants and travellers found the main roads too dangerous for normal commercial activity. The psychological effect proved equally significant, as Athenian citizens could observe smoke rising from burning farmsteads, while being unable to prevent the systematic destruction of their territory's economic infrastructure. The disruption of silver mining operations represented a particularly devastating blow to Athenian financial capacity, as the Laurium mines had provided both direct revenues through state ownership and indirect benefits through taxation of private mining operations. The mine's complex infrastructure, including elaborate drainage systems and processing facilities, required constant maintenance that became impossible under conditions of continuous military pressure. The skilled slave workers who operated these facilities began deserting in large numbers, seeking refuge at Deceleia, where Spartan commanders offered protection and potential freedom in exchange for intelligence about Athenian defensive preparations. The slave desertion problem, encouraged by Spartan policy and facilitated by the Deceleia base's proximity to major population centres, created social and economic disruption that extended far beyond the immediate military situation. Thucydides reports that over 20,000 slaves fled to Deceleia during the first year of occupation, representing an enormous loss of productive capacity across multiple sectors of the Athenian economy. These deserters included not only agricultural workers and miners, but also skilled craftsmen whose specialised knowledge had supported Athens' manufacturing industries and naval construction programs. Simultaneously with establishing pressure on Athenian territory, Sparta initiated the diplomatic and military campaign that would ultimately prove even more destructive to imperial interests: the systematic encouragement of revolts among Athenian allies throughout the Aegean. The Spartan strategy recognised that Athens' fundamental vulnerability lay not in its home territory, but in the tribute-paying cities whose loyalty had been maintained through a combination of military intimidation and economic incentives. The Sicilian disaster had demonstrated Athenian military limitations while creating financial pressures that would force increased tribute demands, providing ideal conditions for encouraging widespread defections. The revolt of Chios in spring 412 BC marked the beginning of this broader imperial collapse and demonstrated both the sophistication of Spartan planning and the extent of Athenian weakness following the Sicilian catastrophe. Chios had remained one of Athens' most reliable allies throughout the war's early phases, contributing ships rather than tribute and maintaining substantial autonomy in domestic affairs. However, the island's oligarchic leadership had maintained covert communications with Spartan agents, waiting for favourable circumstances to declare independence while minimising the risks of Athenian retaliation. The Chian conspiracy had been developing for over a year before the revolt actually occurred, with oligarchic leaders carefully assessing Athenian military capacity while coordinating their plans with potential allies throughout the region. The conspirators recognised that isolated rebellion would invite swift punishment, but coordinated action by multiple cities might overwhelm Athenian capacity for simultaneous responses. The arrival of Spartan naval forces under Chalcideus provided the external support necessary to transform these plans from theoretical possibility into practical reality. The Spartan fleet that appeared off Chios in early summer 412 BC represented a dramatic departure from previous Peloponnesian naval efforts, demonstrating both increased resources and improved tactical capabilities. The 21 triremes under Chalcideus' command included vessels contributed by multiple Peloponnesian League members, while their crews had received intensive training designed to improve their effectiveness against Athenian naval forces. More significantly, the fleet carried substantial quantities of Persian gold that would enable financial incentives for potential rebels while providing resources for sustained military operations. The coordination between Spartan military action and Persian financial support represented a fundamental shift in the war's character, introducing a third major power whose resources and strategic objectives would ultimately determine the conflict's outcome. The Persian decision to intervene reflected both their recognition of opportunities created by Greek exhaustion and their desire to recover the Anatolian territories lost during the previous century of Greek expansion. The satrap Tissaphernes, governing the western regions of the Persian Empire from his capital at Sardis, had been monitoring Greek affairs closely while building relationships with potential allies who might serve Persian interests. The initial agreement between Sparta and Tissaphernes, negotiated through intermediaries who understood both Greek political culture and Persian administrative methods, established the framework for cooperation that would characterize the war's final phase. The Persians agreed to provide financial subsidies that would enable Spartan naval construction and maintenance, while supporting revolts among Athenian allies who possessed strategic value for Persian objectives. In return, Sparta acknowledged Persian sovereignty over the Greek cities of Asia Minor, effectively abandoning the liberation rhetoric that had justified their intervention in the region during the Persian Wars. This diplomatic revolution created profound ideological contradictions that both sides attempted to minimize through careful propaganda and selective emphasis on immediate tactical advantages. The Spartans, who had traditionally presented themselves as liberators of Greek cities from Athenian tyranny, now found themselves allied with the Persian Empire that had previously threatened Greek independence. The arrangement required sophisticated justification that emphasised the temporary nature of Persian cooperation, while arguing that Athenian imperial oppression represented a greater immediate threat to Greek freedom than distant Persian sovereignty. The Persian perspective reflected equally complex calculations about regional balance and long-term strategic objectives. Tissaphernes understood that complete Spartan victory might create a unified Greek power capable of renewed expansion into Persian territory, making it preferable to maintain a balance that would keep both Greek powers sufficiently weakened to prevent future threats. The satrap's financial support for Spartan operations therefore reflected not genuine alliance, but calculated manipulation designed to achieve Persian objectives through Greek exhaustion rather than direct military intervention. The revolt of Miletus, following closely after Chios's declaration of independence, demonstrated how quickly the imperial system could unravel once the process of defection began. Miletus possessed particular strategic importance as the largest Greek city in Asia Minor and a major commercial centre, whose control of trade routes made it valuable to all competing powers. The city's revolt had been coordinated with Chian conspirators to maximise impact while minimising Athenian capacity for effective response, reflecting the sophisticated planning that characterised this phase of anti-Athenian resistance. The Athenian response to these simultaneous revolts revealed both the empire's continued military capabilities and the severe constraints imposed by limited resources and competing priorities. The democracy immediately authorised the use of the 1,000 talent emergency reserve that had been carefully preserved throughout the war's earlier phases, demonstrating their recognition that the empire faced an existential crisis requiring maximum effort. However, the deployment of these resources required careful prioritization among multiple urgent needs, as Athens lacked sufficient forces to suppress all revolts simultaneously while maintaining adequate defences for the home territory. The fleet dispatched to recover Chios under the command of Strombichides represented a substantial commitment of Athenian naval resources, including 37 triremes with experienced crews and substantial numbers of hoplites for amphibious operations. However, the force's arrival revealed the changed strategic situation as they encountered not only Chian resistance, but also Spartan naval forces that had established permanent bases throughout the region. The resulting engagements demonstrated that Athens could no longer achieve quick decisive victories through superior seamanship and tactical expertise, as their enemies had adapted their methods while receiving external support that compensated for traditional disadvantages. The Treaty of Miletus, concluded between Sparta and Tissaphernes in summer 412 BC, formalised the Persian-Spartan cooperation while establishing principles that would govern their relationship throughout the war's remaining phases. The agreement explicitly recognised Persian sovereignty over all territories that had previously belonged to the Persian Empire, including not only the Greek cities of Asia Minor, but also islands such as Chios and Lesbos that had never been under direct Persian control. This sweeping concession reflected Spartan desperation for Persian financial support, while demonstrating their willingness to sacrifice traditional Greek interests for immediate tactical advantages. The treaty's financial provisions established mechanisms for Persian subsidies that would enable sustained Spartan naval operations, while creating dependencies that would ultimately limit Spartan strategic autonomy. Tissaphernes agreed to provide regular payments for maintaining Spartan fleets in Aegean waters, with the specific amounts to be negotiated based on the number of ships and crews requiring support. However, the satrap retained discretionary authority over these payments, creating opportunities for Persian manipulation of Spartan policy through financial pressure that could be applied or withdrawn based on Persian assessments of regional developments. The implementation of these financial arrangements revealed immediate tensions between Persian and Spartan objectives that would complicate their cooperation throughout the remaining war years. Tissaphernes proved reluctant to provide the full subsidies that Spartan operations required, calculating that excessive support might enable decisive Spartan victory that would eliminate Persian leverage over Greek affairs. The resulting disputes over payment schedules and amounts created friction that undermined military effectiveness, while demonstrating the fundamental incompatibility between Persian regional objectives and Spartan victory requirements. The oligarchic revolution that convulsed Athens during 411 BC emerged directly from the military and financial pressures created by the imperial revolts and the failure of democratic institutions to develop effective responses to the unprecedented crisis. The movement's leaders, including prominent figures such as Antiphon, Pisander, and Theramenes, exploited popular frustration with military defeats while arguing that constitutional changes were necessary to secure Persian support that might enable imperial recovery. Their propaganda combined genuine strategic analysis with deliberate manipulation of democratic fears and prejudices. The oligarchic conspiracy had been developing for months before the actual coup occurred, with participants maintaining careful secrecy while building networks of support among citizens who had become disillusioned with democratic leadership. The conspirators recognised that open advocacy for oligarchy would provoke immediate resistance, so they initially focused on more limited constitutional reforms that might attract broader support. Their proposals emphasised the need for more efficient decision-making and expert leadership while avoiding explicit attacks on democratic principles that might unite opposition against them. The role of Alcibiades in encouraging the oligarchic movement demonstrated both his continued influence on Athenian affairs and his willingness to exploit any political opportunity that might enable his return from exile. From his base in Persian territory, the former democratic leader had established communications with oligarchic conspirators while suggesting that constitutional changes might create conditions for Persian support that could restore Athenian fortunes. His messages, transmitted through intermediaries who could not be directly connected to treasonous activities, provided both strategic guidance and personal incentives for potential supporters. The actual implementation of the oligarchic coup in May 411 BC revealed both the conspirators' organisational skills and the extent to which democratic institutions had been weakened by military failures and social disruption. The revolution began with the assassination of prominent democratic leaders, including Androcles, who had been instrumental in Alcibiades' exile and remained committed to traditional constitutional arrangements. These targeted killings created an atmosphere of terror that discouraged resistance while eliminating potential leaders who might organise effective opposition to constitutional changes. The establishment of the 400, an oligarchic council that assumed supreme authority over Athenian government, represented the most dramatic constitutional change in the city's democratic history. The new regime immediately suspended the traditional assembly meetings while transferring executive authority to a small group of wealthy citizens who claimed superior expertise in military and financial matters. Their propaganda emphasised the temporary nature of these arrangements, while promising that broader constitutional reform would eventually create more effective governmental structures. However, the oligarchic government's actual policies revealed fundamental contradictions between their promises of improved effectiveness and their pursuit of narrow class interests that alienated potential supporters while failing to address the empire's strategic challenges. The 400 proved no more capable than their democratic predecessors of developing successful responses to the military pressures created by Spartan-Persian cooperation, while their domestic policies created additional social tensions that weakened rather than strengthened Athenian capacity for sustained resistance. The moderate opposition that emerged within months of the oligarchic coup reflected both the regime's practical failures and the persistence of democratic values among citizens who had initially supported constitutional changes. Leaders such as Theramenes, who had participated in the original conspiracy, began advocating for broader participation in government, while criticising the extreme oligarchs who sought to maintain exclusive control over all significant decisions. This moderate faction argued for a compromise constitution that would preserve some oligarchic innovations while restoring meaningful popular participation in governmental processes. The naval mutiny at Samos that occurred simultaneously with the domestic constitutional crisis demonstrated the empire's continued military potential while revealing the complex relationship between political legitimacy and military effectiveness. The Athenian fleet stationed at Samos, composed largely of citizens from the lower economic classes who had been excluded from the oligarchic government, declared their loyalty to democratic institutions while refusing to recognise the 400's authority. Their resistance created a bizarre situation in which two competing Athenian governments claimed legitimate authority while pursuing contradictory policies. The Samian fleet's decision to recall Alcibiades from Persian territory represented both a desperate attempt to restore effective leadership and recognition that traditional political divisions had become secondary to the empire's survival requirements. The former exile's return to Athenian service, despite his previous defection to Sparta and collaboration with Persian authorities, demonstrated the extent to which military crisis had transformed normal political calculations. His appointment as naval commander reflected not forgiveness for past betrayals, but recognition that his strategic expertise and Persian connections might provide advantages that other leaders could not offer. The overthrow of the 400 in September 411 BC occurred through a combination of popular resistance and moderate oligarchic opposition that reflected both the regime's practical failures and the persistence of democratic political culture. The immediate trigger came when news arrived that the oligarchs were negotiating surrender terms with Sparta, creating outrage among citizens who viewed such discussions as treasonous regardless of their attitudes toward constitutional reform. The moderate opposition, led by Theramenes, exploited this popular anger while positioning themselves as defenders of Athenian independence rather than advocates for pure democracy. The restoration of democratic institutions in Athens coincided with a remarkable naval revival that demonstrated the empire's resilience even under the most desperate circumstances. The fleet stationed at Samos, having maintained its loyalty to democratic principles throughout the oligarchic crisis, became the foundation for a series of spectacular victories that would temporarily restore Athenian confidence, while proving that superior seamanship could still overcome the numerical advantages that Persian gold had provided to Spartan naval forces. The key to this revival lay not merely in the ships themselves, but in the experienced crews who had remained loyal and the innovative commanders who understood how to exploit the tactical opportunities created by enemy overconfidence. Thrasyllus emerged as one of the most effective of these new naval commanders, representing a generation of professional officers whose careers had been forged in the crucible of imperial warfare rather than the traditional aristocratic networks that had dominated Athenian military leadership. His background as a hoplite who had risen through the ranks based on demonstrated competence rather than family connections gave him credibility with the common sailors whose support was essential for effective naval operations. More importantly, his tactical innovations reflected careful study of recent Spartan naval improvements and systematic development of countermeasures that would restore Athenian advantages in ship-to-ship combat. The Battle of Cynossema in late 411 BC provided the first demonstration of these tactical innovations and marked the beginning of Athens' naval resurgence in the face of seemingly impossible odds. The engagement occurred in the narrow waters of the Hellespont, where Spartan Admiral Mindarus had positioned his fleet of 86 ships to intercept Athenian grain convoys while maintaining control over the crucial sea route connecting the Black Sea with the Aegean. The Spartan position appeared strategically sound, as their superior numbers and the confined waters would prevent the kind of complex manoeuvring that had traditionally given Athenian triremes their tactical advantages. Thrasyllus commanded the Athenian left wing with 36 ships, while Thrasybulus led the right wing with an equal number of vessels, leaving the centre under the overall command of the senior admiral. The Athenian formation deliberately appeared weaker than it actually was, with several ships positioned behind headlands where they could not be observed by Spartan scouts, but could intervene at crucial moments during the engagement. This deception reflected sophisticated understanding of both local geography and enemy tactical preferences, as Spartan commanders had developed confidence in their ability to overwhelm Athenian forces through superior numbers and aggressive ramming attacks. The battle's opening phase proceeded exactly as Mindarus had anticipated, with his centre and right wing achieving initial success against the apparently outnumbered Athenian forces. Several Athenian vessels suffered damage from Spartan rams, while others appeared to be retreating toward the Asiatic shore in disorder. The Spartan crews, encouraged by these early successes and eager to complete their victory before Athenian reinforcements could arrive, began pursuing the retreating vessels with the kind of aggressive abandon that had characterized their recent tactical improvements. However, this pursuit brought the Spartan ships into precisely the position that Thrasyllus had planned to exploit. The hidden Athenian reserves emerged from their concealed positions, while the main Athenian lines suddenly reversed course and engaged their pursuers with coordinated ramming attacks that caught the scattered Spartan vessels in vulnerable positions. The superior training and discipline of Athenian crews became immediately apparent as they executed complex maneuvers with precision, while maintaining formation integrity under combat conditions that would have caused less experienced sailors to panic. The psychological impact of this tactical reversal proved as devastating as its immediate military effects. Spartan crews who had believed themselves on the verge of decisive victory found themselves trapped in unfavourable positions, while facing the kind of coordinated Athenian naval assault that had dominated Aegean warfare for decades. The sight of Athenian triremes moving with their characteristic speed and precision while maintaining perfect formation discipline reminded both sides that technical innovations and numerical superiority could not entirely compensate for the accumulated expertise that came from generations of naval warfare. The Spartan fleet's withdrawal from Cynossema left 21 of their vessels in Athenian hands, while demonstrating that Persian financial support had not eliminated the fundamental tactical advantages that superior seamanship could provide under favourable circumstances. More importantly, the victory restored Athenian morale throughout the empire, while proving to wavering allies that reports of the navy's complete decline had been greatly exaggerated. The psychological effects extended beyond immediate military considerations, as the victory suggested that democratic institutions and traditional naval excellence could still achieve results that oligarchic innovations and foreign subsidies could not match. The Battle of Abydos, fought several months later in spring 410 BC, confirmed these tactical lessons while demonstrating the effectiveness of coordinated operations that combined naval superiority with amphibious assault capabilities. Alcibiades, having established his credentials through successful diplomatic negotiations with Persian authorities, assumed overall command of Athenian forces in the Hellespont region and immediately began implementing the kind of comprehensive strategy that had characterized his earlier military planning. His approach integrated naval operations with land-based activities while exploiting local political divisions that Persian policy had inadvertently created. The Spartan position at Abydos represented a significant strategic asset, as the city's location on the Asiatic shore of the Hellespont enabled control over shipping routes while providing access to Persian supply lines and reinforcements. Mindarus had established his naval base there following the defeat at Cynossema, using Persian subsidies to repair damaged vessels while recruiting additional crews from throughout the region. The fortified harbour facilities and substantial garrison made Abydos appear nearly impregnable to direct assault, while its strategic position would enable continued Spartan interference with Athenian commerce, regardless of tactical defeats in open water. Alcibiades' assault plan reflected his understanding that purely naval victories could not achieve lasting strategic results without corresponding control over shore installations and supply networks. The Athenian fleet, now numbering over 60 vessels with fully trained crews, would engage the Spartan navy in the harbour approaches, while simultaneously landing substantial hoplite forces that could threaten the city's landward defences. This coordinated approach required precise timing and communication between naval and land commanders, but it offered possibilities for achieving decisive results that neither component could accomplish independently. The execution of this complex operation demonstrated both Alcibiades' tactical brilliance and the remarkable recovery of Athenian military capabilities despite the empire's desperate strategic situation. The naval engagement proceeded with the kind of methodical precision that characterized Athenian warfare at its best. as individual ship commanders executed predetermined maneuvers while maintaining overall formation discipline under combat conditions. The Spartan fleet, despite its numerical equality and improved equipment, found itself systematically outmaneuvered by opponents whose superior training and tactical coordination gradually created decisive advantages. The simultaneous amphibious assault achieved complete surprise as Athenian hoplites landed at multiple points along the coastline, while the enemy's attention remained focused on the naval battle. These landing forces included not only traditional heavy infantry, but also substantial numbers of light-armed troops and archers whose mobility and firepower proved particularly effective in the broken terrain surrounding Abydos. The coordination between these diverse military components reflected the kind of professional competence that had made Athenian military forces legendary throughout the Mediterranean world. The capture of Abydos eliminated the most important Spartan naval base in the Hellespont region, while providing Athens with substantial material benefits, including captured ships, military equipment, and financial resources that had been accumulated through Persian subsidies. More significantly, the victory demonstrated that coordinated Athenian operations could still achieve decisive results against enemies who possessed both numerical parity and external support. The strategic implications extended throughout the Aegean as Allied cities observed that Athenian military capabilities remained formidable despite recent disasters and political upheavals. The Battle of Cyzicus in 410 BC represented the culmination of this naval revival and provided Athens with its most spectacular victory since the capture of the Spartan forces at Sphacteria 15 years earlier. The engagement occurred when Mindarus, desperate to restore Spartan naval prestige following the defeats at Cynossema and Abydos, assembled the largest Peloponnesian fleet of the entire war for a decisive confrontation that would either eliminate Athenian naval power or demonstrate the futility of continued resistance. His force included not only Spartan vessels, but also substantial contingents from Corinth, Syracuse, and other allied cities whose participation reflected their continued commitment to the anti-Athenian coalition. Alcibiades' strategy for the Cyzicus campaign demonstrated his mastery of complex military operations that integrated deception, coordination, and tactical innovation to achieve overwhelming superiority at the decisive point. The Athenian fleet approached the enemy position in 3 separate squadrons that appeared to be operating independently, creating the impression that they lacked unified command while actually executing a carefully coordinated plan designed to exploit Spartan tactical assumptions. This deception required extraordinary discipline from individual ship commanders who had to maintain their assigned positions while resisting the natural tendency to concentrate forces when facing superior enemy numbers. The battle's opening phase proceeded according to Alcibiades' plan, as Mindarus deployed his entire fleet to engage what appeared to be an isolated Athenian squadron under Alcibiades' direct command. The Spartan formation advanced with the confidence that had been restored by recent Persian support and tactical improvements, expecting to achieve decisive victory through superior numbers and aggressive ramming attacks. The Spartan crews had been trained to exploit their ships' heavier construction and reinforced prows, modifications that had proven effective in previous engagements against Athenian vessels, whose traditional advantages in speed and maneuverability had been reduced by these technical innovations. However, the appearance of the remaining Athenian squadrons at precisely the moment when the Spartan fleet was fully committed to its attack transformed the tactical situation completely. Thrasyllus and Theramenes emerged from concealed positions with their combined forces, creating a 3-2 numerical advantage while catching the enemy fleet in an extended formation that could not respond effectively to attacks from multiple directions. The coordination required for this maneuver reflected months of careful planning and training that had restored the kind of tactical sophistication that had made Athenian naval forces dominant throughout the previous decades. The destruction of the Spartan fleet at Cyzicus exceeded even Athenian expectations, as enemy resistance collapsed with unprecedented speed, once the tactical situation became clear. The Peloponnesian vessels, caught in unfavourable positions and unable to execute coordinated defensive manoeuvres, fell victim to the kind of systematic destruction that superior seamanship could inflict under optimal conditions. The Athenian crews, inspired by their recent victories and fighting with the desperation of men who understood that defeat would mean the end of their empire, pressed their attacks with relentless efficiency that left no opportunity for enemy recovery. The capture or destruction of the entire Spartan fleet eliminated Peloponnesian naval power in the Aegean, while providing Athens with material resources that temporarily alleviated the financial pressures created by the loss of tribute revenues. More than 60 enemy vessels fell into Athenian hands, along with their crews and the substantial quantities of Persian gold that had been intended to finance continued operations. The psychological impact proved even more significant than these material gains, as the victory demonstrated that Athenian naval supremacy could be restored despite the empire's apparent decline. The death of Mindarus during the final phase of the battle eliminated the most competent Spartan naval commander, while symbolically marking the end of their brief period of maritime competitiveness. The Spartan admiral had fought with personal courage that reflected the highest traditions of his society, but his tactical innovations had proven inadequate against opponents whose superior training and strategic vision enabled them to exploit every advantage that careful planning could provide. His death represented not only the loss of individual leadership but also the failure of the broader Spartan strategy that had attempted to challenge Athenian naval dominance through technical improvements and Persian financial support. The strategic consequences of Cyzicus reverberated throughout the Greek world as cities that had recently defected from the Athenian Empire began reconsidering their positions in light of the restored naval balance. The victory demonstrated that reports of Athenian decline had been premature and that the empire retained sufficient military capacity to punish disloyalty while rewarding continued allegiance. Several cities that had declared independence following the Sicilian disaster now sent embassies to Athens seeking terms for a renewed alliance, while others began withholding support from Spartan operations that no longer appeared likely to achieve decisive success. However, the most significant consequence of the Athenian naval revival was the dramatic return of Alcibiades to Athens in 407 BC, marking one of the most remarkable political resurrections in Greek history. The man who had fled the city 8 years earlier under charges of sacrilege and treason now returned as the architect of spectacular military victories that had restored imperial fortunes when all seemed lost. His triumphant entry into Piraeus harbour, leading a fleet laden with captured enemy vessels and Persian gold, created scenes of popular enthusiasm that demonstrated the Athenian democracy's capacity for both vindictiveness and forgiveness when political calculations aligned with military success. The elaborate ceremonies that accompanied Alcibiades' restoration to favour reflected both popular gratitude for his military achievements and careful political management designed to legitimise his return while minimising references to his previous betrayals. The Democratic Assembly voted to restore his property and civic rights, while formally absolving him of the religious charges that had originally driven him into exile. More significantly, they elected him to the prestigious position of strategos autocrator, granting him unprecedented military authority that reflected both recognition of his strategic competence and acknowledgement that desperate circumstances required exceptional leadership arrangements. Alcibiades' acceptance speech to the Assembly, as recorded by contemporary observers, revealed both his political sophistication and his understanding of the delicate balance required to maintain popular support while pursuing the aggressive policies necessary for imperial recovery. He acknowledged past mistakes while attributing them to the pressures of unjust persecution, positioning himself as a victim of political conspiracy rather than a willing traitor to Athenian interests. His promises of future victories and imperial expansion appealed to popular desires for restored greatness, while carefully avoiding specific commitments that might prove impossible to fulfill. The renewed confidence that Alcibiades' return generated throughout the Athenian Empire provided temporary relief from the centrifugal forces that had threatened to tear the alliance system apart following the Sicilian disaster. His reputation for strategic brilliance and tactical innovation encouraged allied cities to maintain their loyalty, while deterring potential rebels who recognised that his leadership significantly increased the likelihood of swift and effective retaliation. The psychological impact of his restoration extended beyond immediate military considerations, symbolising the empire's resilience and capacity for recovery even under the most adverse circumstances. However, the very qualities that made Alcibiades effective as a military commander and popular leader also contained the seeds of his ultimate downfall. His aristocratic arrogance and personal extravagance created resentment among democratic politicians who viewed him as a threat to traditional constitutional arrangements, while his strategic boldness led to the kind of risky decisions that could transform spectacular success into catastrophic failure. The expectations created by his recent victories placed enormous pressure on him to achieve continued success, while the political enemies who had never forgiven his previous betrayals waited for opportunities to exploit any setbacks. The construction and deployment of new Spartan fleets financed by Cyrus the Younger represented the most serious long-term threat to the Athenian naval revival, as Persian resources enabled sustained maritime competition that had previously been impossible for land-based powers. Cyrus, the younger son of King Darius II, had been appointed to oversee Persian interests in western Anatolia, with specific instructions to prevent decisive Athenian victory while maintaining the regional balance that served Persian strategic objectives. His youth and ambition made him more willing than Tissaphernes to provide substantial military support, while his access to the royal treasury enabled financial commitments that dwarfed previous Persian involvement in Greek affairs. The shipbuilding program that Cyrus initiated in 408 BC represented a fundamental challenge to Athenian naval supremacy, as Persian financial resources enabled the construction of vessels whose quality and quantity threatened to overwhelm even superior Athenian seamanship through sheer numerical advantage. The new Spartan fleet included ships built in Phoenician yards, using the finest materials and most advanced construction techniques available, while their crews received intensive training supported by Persian subsidies that had eliminated the financial constraints that had previously limited Peloponnesian naval development. Lysander's appointment as Navarch to command these new Persian-subsidized forces brought to Spartan naval operations the kind of strategic vision and tactical innovation that had previously been lacking in their maritime efforts. Unlike previous Spartan naval commanders who had attempted to adapt traditional military methods to naval warfare, Lysander understood that success required fundamentally different approaches that exploited the unique characteristics of maritime combat. His background included extensive study of Athenian naval tactics and careful analysis of the factors that had enabled their dominance, providing him with insights that would prove crucial in developing effective countermeasures. The Battle of Notium in 407 BC marked the beginning of Lysander's challenge to restore Athenian naval confidence and demonstrated how quickly tactical superiority could be lost when overconfidence led to strategic miscalculations. The engagement occurred when Alcibiades, confident in his recent victories and eager to maintain the aggressive momentum that had characterized his return to favor, departed from the main fleet to conduct diplomatic negotiations with potential allies. His absence left the fleet under the command of his subordinate Antiochus, an experienced pilot whose tactical competence was unquestioned, but whose strategic judgment would prove fatally flawed. Antiochus had received explicit instructions to avoid major engagements, while Alcibiades remained absent, reflecting recognition that the political consequences of defeat would be catastrophic regardless of its tactical significance. However, the proximity of Lysander's fleet and the provocative nature of Spartan naval maneuvers created pressures that tested the subordinate commander's discipline and judgment. When Spartan vessels began conducting aggressive reconnaissance near the Athenian anchorage, Antiochus found himself faced with the difficult choice between appearing cowardly through inaction or risking unauthorized combat that might achieve spectacular results. The tactical engagement that followed revealed both the continued effectiveness of Athenian naval training and the fatal consequences of fighting under unfavourable strategic conditions. Antiochus led a small squadron against what appeared to be an isolated portion of the Spartan fleet, expecting to achieve quick success through superior seamanship before withdrawing to the safety of the main anchorage. However, Lysander had carefully prepared this apparent opportunity as a trap, positioning the majority of his forces where they could intervene decisively once the Athenian vessels were committed to combat. The destruction of Antiochus and 15 Athenian triremes provided Lysander with exactly the kind of tactical victory that would establish his reputation while undermining confidence in Alcibiades' leadership. The Spartan commander's careful preparation and disciplined execution demonstrated that Persian resources, when combined with competent leadership and innovative tactics, could challenge even the most experienced Athenian crews under favourable circumstances. More importantly, the victory proved that Lysander possessed the strategic patience and tactical sophistication necessary to exploit Athenian weaknesses, rather than simply attempting to overwhelm them through superior numbers. The political consequences of Notium proved even more devastating for Alcibiades than the immediate military losses, as his enemies in Athens seized upon the defeat as evidence that his restoration had been premature and dangerous. The Democratic Assembly, which had celebrated his return with such enthusiasm only months earlier, now subjected him to harsh criticism that reflected both genuine concern about military competence and political calculation by opponents who had never accepted his rehabilitation. The charges focused not only on the tactical defeat itself, but also on his absence from the fleet during the crucial engagement, suggesting that personal interests had taken precedence over military responsibilities. Alcibiades' response to these criticisms revealed both his political desperation and his recognition that democratic forgiveness had limits that could be exceeded through military failure. His attempts to minimize the significance of Notium, while emphasizing his overall strategic success, failed to satisfy an assembly that had grown increasingly suspicious of commanders whose personal ambitions might conflict with imperial interests. The restoration of his civic rights and military authority, which had seemed so secure following his spectacular victories, now appeared fragile and dependent on continued success that might prove impossible to maintain. The final exile of Alcibiades following his removal from command in 406 BC marked the end of the most remarkable political career in Athenian history and eliminated the empire's most innovative strategic thinker at precisely the moment when such leadership was most desperately needed. His departure from Athens represented not only personal tragedy, but also strategic catastrophe, as his intimate knowledge of Athenian capabilities and Persian politics would once again become available to enemies who could exploit such intelligence for maximum advantage. The pattern of betrayal and rehabilitation that had characterized his entire career would continue, but Athens would never again benefit from his extraordinary combination of strategic vision and tactical brilliance. The departure of Alcibiades from Athenian service in 406 BC created a strategic vacuum that Athens could ill afford at the moment when Lysander's methodical campaign was beginning to bear fruit throughout the eastern Aegean. The Democratic Assembly, having rejected their most capable naval commander in a fit of political recrimination following the Notium defeat, now faced the daunting challenge of maintaining imperial cohesion while confronting an enemy who possessed both substantial Persian financial backing and increasingly sophisticated tactical methods. The replacement commanders appointed to fill this void, while individually competent, lacked the strategic vision and personal authority that had enabled Alcibiades to coordinate complex operations across multiple theatres while managing the delicate diplomatic relationships that held the empire together. Conon emerged as the most prominent of these new naval leaders, bringing to his command extensive experience in Aegean operations and a reputation for tactical competence that had been earned through years of successful service in subsidiary roles. His appointment reflected the Assembly's preference for proven reliability over dramatic innovation, as democratic institutions sought to avoid the kind of spectacular risks that had characterized Alcibiades' leadership while maintaining sufficient military pressure to prevent further imperial disintegration. However, Conon's conservative approach, while minimizing the likelihood of catastrophic defeats, also reduced the possibility of achieving the decisive victories that might restore Athenian strategic initiative. The financial pressures facing Athens during this period exceeded anything the empire had previously experienced, as the loss of tribute from rebellious allies coincided with the enormous costs of maintaining competitive naval forces against Persian subsidized opponents. The treasury reserves that had sustained operations following the Sicilian disaster were now completely exhausted, while the disruption of silver mining at Laurium had eliminated one of the most reliable sources of state revenue. The assembly found itself forced to consider increasingly desperate expedients, including the melting down of golden statues from the Acropolis and the imposition of emergency taxes on wealthy citizens who had already contributed far beyond their normal obligations. The decision to create a new fleet using these precious metal reserves demonstrated both the empire's determination to continue resistance and the extent of its financial desperation. The golden Achaia statues that had adorned the Parthenon since its completion were removed and transported to the Mint, where skilled craftsmen converted them into the silver coins necessary for naval construction and crew payments. This unprecedented action shocked many citizens who viewed the statues as sacred objects whose destruction might invite divine retribution. But the military necessity proved overwhelming as alternative funding sources had been completely exhausted. The construction program that followed produced approximately 110 new triremes within 8 months, representing a remarkable achievement of industrial organization that demonstrated Athens' continued capacity for mobilizing resources under extreme pressure. The shipyards at Piraeus worked continuously throughout winter, 406, 405 BC, with multiple shifts of craftsmen labouring to complete vessels whose construction had been accelerated through the use of standardized components and simplified designs. The resulting ships, while perhaps lacking some of the refinements that characterized earlier Athenian naval construction, possessed adequate seaworthiness and combat capability for the desperate circumstances facing the empire. The crews assembled for these vessels reflected the democratic character of Athenian naval service, while revealing the social changes that prolonged warfare had created throughout the empire. Traditional distinctions between citizens, metics, and even slaves had become increasingly blurred as military necessity overrode conventional social hierarchies. Experienced oarsmen commanded premium wages regardless of their legal status, while tactical positions were filled based on demonstrated competence rather than birth or wealth. The resulting naval forces possessed a professional character that differed markedly from the citizen militias that had dominated earlier phases of Greek warfare. The Battle of Arginosae in summer 406 BC provided this hastily assembled fleet with an opportunity to demonstrate that Athenian naval capabilities remained formidable despite the empire's desperate strategic situation. The engagement occurred when Callicratidas, who had succeeded Lysander as Spartan navarch under the annual rotation system, established a blockade of Mytilene with 140 ships in an attempt to force the surrender of Conon's fleet, which had been trapped in the harbour following an unsuccessful attempt to relieve the besieged city. The Spartan commander's position appeared strategically sound, as his superior numbers and control of the harbour approaches would eventually force either a desperate breakout attempt or capitulation through starvation. The Athenian relief fleet that sailed from Piraeus to challenge this blockade represented the largest naval force that Athens had assembled since the Sicilian expedition, with 8 strategoi commanding 150 triremes, whose crews included veterans of previous campaigns alongside newly trained personnel whose combat experience remained limited. The fleet's organisation reflected careful attention to tactical coordination, with individual squadrons assigned specific roles in the complex battle plan that the commanders had developed during their voyage across the Aegean. The presence of substantial numbers of hoplites aboard each vessel provided additional combat capability, while ensuring that captured enemy ships could be properly secured and sailed away from the battlefield. Callicratidas had positioned his fleet in a conventional line formation that reflected traditional Spartan preference for direct confrontation over tactical manoeuvring, with his own squadron holding the place of honour on the right wing, while allied contingents from Corinth, Boeotia and other cities occupied the centre and left portions of the battle line. The Spartan commander's tactical plan emphasised the aggressive ramming attacks that had proven effective in recent engagements, supported by the superior construction and crew training that Persian subsidies had enabled. His confidence in achieving decisive victory reflected both numerical superiority and recent successes that had demonstrated Spartan ability to compete effectively with Athenian naval forces. The battle's opening phase proceeded with the methodical precision that characterised major naval engagements, as both fleets advanced in parallel lines, while individual ship commanders prepared for the complex manoeuvring that would determine the engagement's outcome. The morning sun reflected off bronze ram fittings and polished shields as 290 triremes moved across relatively calm waters, their crews chanting paeans while maintaining the steady rhythm necessary for coordinated movement. The sight of so many vessels operating in close formation created a spectacle that impressed even experienced naval officers who had witnessed numerous previous battles throughout their careers. The collision between the opposing battle lines occurred with the tremendous crash of bronze against timber that marked the beginning of ship-to-ship combat, as individual vessels attempted to ram enemy hulls while avoiding similar attacks from multiple directions. The superior training of Athenian crews became immediately apparent as they executed the complex manoeuvres required for effective ramming while maintaining sufficient spacing to avoid collisions with friendly vessels. The tactical innovations that Athenian naval commanders had developed during decades of maritime warfare provided crucial advantages in the confined space, where hundreds of ships manoeuvred for favourable attacking positions. Callicratidas fell early in the engagement when his flagship became isolated, during an aggressive attack that brought it within range of multiple Athenian vessels, whose coordinated assault overwhelmed the Spartan crew despite their superior equipment and training. The Spartan commander's death eliminated unified enemy leadership, while providing Athenian forces with visible evidence of their tactical success, creating psychological momentum that spread throughout both fleets as individual ship commanders observed the fate of the enemy admiral. The loss of central coordination proved particularly devastating for the Spartan allied contingents, whose crews lacked the independent tactical training that might have enabled continued effective resistance. The systematic destruction of enemy resistance that followed demonstrated the effectiveness of Athenian naval methods when applied under favourable circumstances by properly trained and adequately equipped crews. The Spartan fleet lost 77 vessels captured or destroyed, while Athenian casualties totalled only 25 ships, reflecting both superior tactical performance and the psychological impact of early success that had encouraged enemy crews to flee rather than fight hopeless battles. The material gains included not only captured vessels and equipment, but also substantial quantities of Persian gold that had been intended to finance continued Spartan naval operations. The strategic consequences of Arginissae extended far beyond its immediate tactical results, as the victory demonstrated that Athenian naval supremacy could still be restored through competent leadership and adequate resources despite the empire's apparent decline. The destruction of the largest Spartan fleet assembled during the entire war eliminated their capacity for major naval operations, while providing Athens with breathing space that might enable imperial recovery if properly exploited. Allied cities throughout the Aegean observed that reports of Athenian military collapse had been premature, while potential rebels reconsidered their positions in light of restored imperial naval capabilities. However, the political aftermath of this spectacular military success revealed the extent to which prolonged warfare and democratic suspicion had corrupted Athenian political culture, transforming what should have been celebration into recrimination and judicial murder. The failure to rescue survivors from the 25 lost Athenian vessels became the focus of intense controversy when families of the dead demanded explanations for why their relatives had been abandoned to drown in Aegean waters, while the victorious fleet pursued fleeing enemies. The charges that emerged from these grievances would ultimately prove more destructive to Athenian interests than any military defeat. The trial of the 6 surviving strategoi who had commanded at Arginusai represented one of the most shameful episodes in Athenian democratic history, demonstrating how popular institutions could be manipulated by demagogues who exploited legitimate grief for partisan political advantage. The prosecution argued that the commanders had prioritised pursuit of tactical victory over their fundamental obligation to preserve Athenian lives, citing specific instances where rescue operations might have been conducted if proper priorities had been established. These charges resonated with popular audiences who had lost family members, while failing to understand the tactical realities that had made rescue operations impossible under combat conditions. The defendants attempted to explain that severe weather conditions following the battle had made rescue operations impossible, without risking additional vessels and crews, while emphasising that their tactical decisions had achieved the most complete naval victory in recent Athenian history. They pointed out that the storm that prevented rescue efforts had developed suddenly after the engagement's conclusion, creating sea conditions that would have endangered any vessels attempting to operate in the area where their colleagues had been lost. Their arguments reflected both accurate tactical analysis and genuine grief for fallen comrades, but they failed to satisfy popular emotions that demanded accountability for perceived failures of leadership. The Assembly's decision to try all 6 commanders collectively rather than individually violated established legal procedures while creating conditions that made effective defence impossible. Traditional Athenian law required separate trials for each defendant, allowing proper examination of individual responsibilities and circumstances that might justify particular decisions. The collective trial, demanded by demagogues who understood that individual proceedings might result in acquittals, ensured that popular anger could overwhelm legal protections while preventing detailed analysis of the tactical situation that had made rescue operations impossible. The execution of the 6 strategoi in late 406 BC eliminated some of Athens' most experienced naval commanders, while demonstrating to potential successors that military success provided no protection against democratic vengeance when political calculations favoured punishment over justice. Among the executed was Pericles the Younger, son of the great statesman, whose death symbolised the extent to which Athenian political culture had deteriorated since his father's era. The loss of such experienced leadership at the moment when the empire faced its greatest crisis represented strategic suicide that would have consequences extending far beyond immediate military considerations. The psychological impact of these executions reverberated throughout Athenian military and political circles, as competent officers recognised that democratic institutions now posed threats to their personal safety that might exceed the dangers of enemy action. Several prominent commanders, including Conon, began avoiding aggressive tactical decisions that might achieve spectacular success, but could also provide grounds for future prosecution if any aspect of their execution proved controversial. This defensive mentality, while understandable given recent events, reduced the likelihood of achieving the decisive victories that the empire desperately needed to restore its strategic position. Lysander's return to naval command in 405 BC, despite the technical violation of Spartan law that prohibited individuals from serving consecutive terms as nevarch, reflected both his proven competence and Spartan recognition that desperate circumstances required exceptional leadership arrangements. His reappointment as epistolius, or deputy commander, provided legal cover for what was essentially a continuation of his previous authority, while his established relationships with Persian officials ensured continued financial support for Spartan naval operations. The return of such experienced leadership provided Sparta with crucial advantages at precisely the moment when Athenian command structure had been weakened through political persecution. The systematic campaign that Lysander initiated following his return demonstrated both strategic sophistication and understanding of Athenian vulnerabilities that extended beyond purely military considerations. Rather than seeking immediate decisive battle, the Spartan commander focused on methodically reducing Athenian influence throughout the Aegean while building networks of local support that would ensure lasting political changes favourable to Spartan interests. His approach combined military pressure with diplomatic initiatives that promised autonomy and oligarchic government to cities willing to abandon their Athenian allegiances. The capture of Lampsacus in early 405 BC provided Lysander with a crucial strategic base, controlling access to the Hellespont, while demonstrating his ability to coordinate naval operations with amphibious assault capabilities. The city's fortified position on the Asiatic shore had made it a key link in Athenian control over grain shipments from the Black Sea, while its substantial harbour facilities could support major naval operations throughout the region. The systematic siege that preceded its capture revealed both Spartan improvements in military engineering and Lysander's understanding that lasting success required control over strategic positions rather than mere tactical victories. The Athenian response to Lampsacus's fall revealed both the empire's continued military potential and the strategic confusion that had resulted from the loss of experienced leadership following the Arginusai executions. The fleet that sailed to challenge Lysander included 180 triremes with adequate crews and equipment, representing a substantial commitment of remaining imperial resources that demonstrated Athens' determination to maintain control over the crucial grain route. However, the commanders appointed to lead this expedition lacked both the tactical expertise and strategic authority necessary for effective operations against an opponent of Lysander's calibre. The positioning of the Athenian fleet at Aegospotami across the Hellespont from Lampsacus reflected both tactical necessity and strategic miscalculation that would prove catastrophic for imperial interests. The beach where the ships were drawn up provided adequate shelter from prevailing winds, while offering access to fresh water and supplies that the crews required for sustained operations. However, the position also placed the fleet in a vulnerable location where it could be observed continuously by Spartan scouts, while lacking adequate fortifications or escape routes that might enable effective response to enemy attack. The routine that developed during the 4 days preceding the final battle revealed the extent to which Athenian naval discipline had deteriorated under the pressures of prolonged warfare and inadequate leadership. Each morning the fleet would deploy in battle formation and challenge Lysander to combat, but when the Spartans declined engagement, the Athenian crews would return to shore and disperse throughout the surrounding area to gather supplies and conduct personal business. This pattern, while reflecting understandable human needs for food and rest, created exactly the kind of predictable vulnerability that a commander of Lysander's experience could exploit for maximum advantage. Lysander's careful observation of these Athenian routines reflected both tactical patience and strategic understanding that decisive victory required optimal conditions rather than hasty action that might achieve only partial success. The Spartan commander positioned scouts where they could monitor enemy activities while maintaining his own fleet in a state of readiness that would enable immediate action when favourable circumstances developed. His willingness to wait for perfect tactical conditions demonstrated the kind of professional discipline that had made him the most effective Spartan naval commander of the entire war. The attack at Aegospotami on the 5th day caught the dispersed Athenian crews in exactly the vulnerable condition that Lysander had anticipated, transforming what should have been a routine deployment into complete catastrophe. The Spartan fleet approached the beach while most Athenian personnel were scattered throughout the countryside, leaving only skeleton crews aboard vessels that could not be manned quickly enough to respond effectively to the surprise assault. The few ships that managed to escape did so only because their crews happened to be aboard when the attack began, while the remainder fell into enemy hands along with nearly 3,000 prisoners whose fate would demonstrate Spartan determination to achieve lasting victory. The execution of these prisoners, with the sole exception of the Athenian commander Adeimantus, who was spared under suspicious circumstances that suggested possible treachery, marked a dramatic departure from traditional Greek warfare practices, while sending an unmistakable message about Spartan intentions regarding the conflict's resolution. Lysander's decision to massacre captives who would traditionally have been ransomed or exchanged reflected both his understanding that the war had reached a decisive phase and his determination to eliminate potential future resistance through terror. The psychological impact of this brutality extended throughout the remaining Athenian territories as word spread that surrender offered no guarantee of survival. The strategic consequences of Aegospotami proved immediately apparent as Athenian control over the Hellespont collapsed completely, cutting off the grain supplies that sustained the urban population while eliminating the tribute revenues that had financed imperial administration. The loss of the fleet meant that Athens could no longer project power beyond Attica, while the capture of so many experienced naval personnel eliminated the human resources necessary for constructing replacement forces, even if financial means could somehow be found. The empire that had dominated the Aegean for over half a century found itself reduced to a single city, facing inevitable starvation, unless terms could be negotiated with victorious enemies. Lysander's systematic campaign to secure the remaining Athenian territories proceeded with methodical efficiency that reflected both strategic planning and understanding of local political conditions throughout the region. Rather than attempting to capture every fortified position through direct assault, the Spartan commander offered generous terms to cities that surrendered voluntarily while making examples of those that chose continued resistance. This combination of incentives and threats proved remarkably effective in securing rapid submission from communities whose loyalty to Athens had been maintained more through fear than genuine affection. The siege of Athens that began in autumn 405 BC represented the culmination of nearly 3 decades of warfare, while demonstrating how completely the strategic situation had been reversed since the conflict's beginning. The city that had once commanded tribute from hundreds of allied communities now found itself completely isolated, with Spartan armies controlling the land approaches while Lysander's fleet prevented any possibility of relief by sea. The long walls that had provided security during previous invasions now became a trap that concentrated the population in an area where food supplies would be quickly exhausted without external support. The blockade's effectiveness became apparent within weeks, as grain reserves accumulated during the previous harvest proved inadequate for sustaining the swollen urban population that included not only permanent residents, but also refugees from throughout Attica who had sought protection within the fortified area. The systematic nature of Spartan control over supply routes eliminated even the possibility of small-scale smuggling that might have provided minimal relief, while the execution of anyone caught attempting to bring supplies into the city demonstrated enemy determination to achieve complete victory through starvation. The political debates that occurred within Athens during the siege's early months revealed both the persistence of democratic institutions under extreme pressure and the extent to which prolonged warfare had transformed popular attitudes toward traditional enemies and allies. Conservative politicians argued for immediate negotiations that might secure reasonable terms before the city's position deteriorated further, while more radical voices insisted that continued resistance might yet produce favourable developments that would enable imperial recovery. These discussions occurred against a background of increasing hunger and social tension that tested democratic cohesion while providing opportunities for extremist factions to exploit popular desperation. The Spartan terms for ending the siege, delivered through intermediaries who could communicate safely with Athenian authorities, revealed both the extent of their victory and their understanding of the political changes necessary to ensure lasting peace favourable to their interests. The demands included not only the destruction of the long walls and the surrender of all but 12 ships, but also the recall of all exiles and the establishment of a government friendly to Spartan interests. These conditions would effectively eliminate Athens as an independent power while creating political arrangements that would prevent any future challenge to Spartan hegemony throughout the Greek world. The final surrender of Athens in April 404 BC mark not merely the end of a particular war, but the collapse of an entire world order that had shaped Greek civilization for over half a century. The terms negotiated by the exhausted Athenian assembly represented complete capitulation to Spartan demands, requiring the destruction of the long walls that had symbolized Athenian security, the reduction of their fleet to 12 vessels suitable only for coastal patrol, and most ominously, the acceptance of a government friendly to Sparta that would ensure permanent subordination to Peloponnesian interests. The physical demolition of Athens' fortifications began immediately, with Spartan engineers directing the systematic destruction of walls whose construction had required decades of labour and enormous financial investment. The sound of hammers and crowbars echoing across the Attic plain provided a fitting soundtrack for the death of the most ambitious imperial project in Greek history. Lysander's entry into Piraeus with his victorious fleet created scenes that demonstrated both the completeness of Spartan triumph and the calculated nature of their victory celebrations. The Spartan navarch had orchestrated his arrival to coincide with a religious festival, enabling him to present the conquest as divinely sanctioned while providing appropriate ceremonial context for the political changes that would follow. The sight of Spartan triremes occupying the harbour that had once been the nerve centre of Athenian naval power impressed observers with the dramatic reversal of fortunes, while the systematic confiscation of remaining Athenian vessels eliminated any possibility of future maritime resistance. The establishment of the 30 tyrants represented the most radical transformation of Athenian political culture since the overthrow of the Pisistratid tyranny over a century earlier. The oligarchic government imposed by Spartan authority included prominent figures such as Critias and Theramenes, whose previous involvement in the oligarchic revolution of 411 BC had provided them with both experience in constitutional manipulation and networks of supporters among wealthy citizens who had suffered under democratic policies. However, their appointment reflected Spartan political calculations rather than genuine popular support, creating a regime whose legitimacy depended entirely on foreign military backing and domestic terror. Critias emerged as the dominant figure within this oligarchic council, bringing to his leadership a combination of intellectual sophistication and ruthless determination that would characterize the regime's brief but bloody tenure. His background included philosophical training under prominent sophists and extensive travel throughout the Greek world, providing him with theoretical frameworks for justifying oligarchic rule while understanding the practical methods necessary for maintaining power against popular opposition. His personal animosity toward democratic institutions reflected both ideological conviction and bitter experience of exile and persecution under the previous regime. The 30's initial policies revealed both their determination to transform Athenian society fundamentally and their understanding that such changes required the elimination of potential opposition through systematic violence. Their first actions included the compilation of proscription lists that identified democratic leaders, wealthy metics, and other individuals whose continued existence might threaten oligarchic security. The resulting reign of terror eliminated approximately 1,500 victims within the first few months, creating an atmosphere of fear that paralysed potential resistance, while demonstrating the regime's willingness to employ unlimited violence in pursuit of political objectives. The confiscation of property belonging to executed victims provided the 30 with both financial resources for maintaining their supporters and economic incentives for collaboration among citizens who might benefit from redistributed wealth. The systematic auction of seized assets created opportunities for political allies to acquire valuable properties at reduced prices while generating revenues that could fund the regime's administrative and military requirements. This economic dimension of the terror revealed the extent to which political persecution served multiple objectives beyond simple elimination of opposition. The establishment of the 3,000, a select group of citizens who alone retained political rights under the new constitution, represented an attempt to create a stable social base for oligarchic rule while excluding the majority of the population from a meaningful participation in government. The selection criteria emphasize property ownership and social connections rather than democratic principles, effectively reversing the constitutional developments that had characterized Athenian political evolution since Cleisthenes. The resulting system concentrated power in the hands of wealthy families while reducing the majority of citizens to the status of subjects whose political opinions carried no weight in governmental decisions. The regime's military policies reflected both their dependence on Spartan support and their recognition that domestic opposition would require constant suppression through force. The 30 maintained a garrison of 700 Spartan hoplites under the command of Polybius, whose presence in the city provided both visible evidence of foreign control and practical security against potential uprisings. The cost of maintaining these troops fell upon the Athenian treasury, creating additional financial burdens that necessitated increased taxation and property confiscations that further alienated the population. The philosophical and cultural implications of oligarchic rule extended beyond immediate political changes to encompass broader questions about the nature of justice, citizenship, and social organisation that had been central to Athenian intellectual development. The 30s policies reflected theoretical frameworks derived from sophistic teaching that emphasised the natural superiority of elite minorities over ignorant masses, providing intellectual justification for political arrangements that violated traditional Greek concepts of civic equality. The regime's supporters included prominent intellectuals who viewed oligarchy as a rational alternative to the emotional decision-making that had characterised democratic assemblies during the war years. However, the practical implementation of these theoretical principles revealed fundamental contradictions between oligarchic ideology and the social realities of Athenian life. The attempt to restrict citizenship to a narrow elite ignored the complex economic relationships that had developed during decades of imperial expansion, while the exclusion of metics and other non-citizen groups eliminated essential sources of commercial and artisanal expertise. The resulting economic disruption compounded the political alienation created by violent persecution, undermining the regime's stability, while demonstrating the practical limitations of purely theoretical approaches to governance. The growing opposition to oligarchic rule manifested initially through passive resistance and emigration rather than organised rebellion, as potential opponents recognised that direct confrontation with a regime backed by Spartan military power would prove suicidal. Thousands of citizens fled to neighbouring cities or established exile communities in territories beyond Spartan control, creating networks of displaced persons who maintained communications with sympathisers remaining in Athens. These exile groups provided both alternative leadership for potential resistance movements and diplomatic representation for anti-oligarchic interests in negotiations with foreign powers. Thrasybulus emerged as the most effective leader of this exile movement, combining military experience gained during the war years with political skills that enabled him to coordinate diverse opposition groups while maintaining security against oligarchic intelligence networks. His background as a successful naval commander provided credibility with military veterans who had suffered under the 30s policies, while his moderate democratic views attracted support from citizens who opposed oligarchic extremism without necessarily endorsing radical political changes. His establishment of a base at Phyla, a fortress controlling access routes into Attica, demonstrated both strategic understanding and recognition that successful resistance would require secure territorial foundations. The initial force that gathered around Thrasybulus at Phyla numbered only 70 men, but their symbolic importance exceeded their military strength as they represented the first organised challenge to oligarchic authority since the regime's establishment. The fortress's strategic position enabled control over mountain passes that connected Attica with Boeotia, providing opportunities for intercepting communications and supply lines, while offering escape routes if Spartan forces attempted to eliminate the resistance base. The site's defensive advantages had been recognised since archaic times, with natural fortifications supplemented by human construction that made direct assault extremely difficult. The 30s' response to this challenge revealed both their military limitations and their growing isolation from the Athenian population. The expedition they dispatched to eliminate the Phyle garrison included the Spartan troops and loyal Athenian forces, but their attack failed to achieve decisive results due to difficult terrain and determined resistance from defenders who understood that capture would mean certain death. The unsuccessful assault demonstrated that oligarchic military capabilities remained limited despite foreign support, while the survival of the resistance base encouraged additional opponents to consider active opposition. The expansion of the resistance movement during winter 404-403 BC reflected both growing popular opposition to oligarchic policies and the regime's inability to maintain effective control over Attic territory beyond the immediate vicinity of Athens itself. Thrasybulus' force grew to over 1,000 men as exiles returned from neighbouring cities, while citizens who had initially accepted oligarchic rule began joining the resistance in response to continued persecution and economic hardship. The movement's growth demonstrated that the 30s' terror tactics had failed to create lasting stability, while their exclusion of the majority from political participation had generated widespread resentment. The capture of Piraeus by Thrasybulus in early 403 BC transformed the resistance from a guerrilla movement into a serious military challenge that threatened the oligarchic regime's survival. The port's strategic importance as Athens' connection to the outside world made its control crucial for any group seeking to govern the city, while its fortifications provided defensive advantages that would enable prolonged resistance against superior forces. The successful assault that secured these positions demonstrated both improved rebel capabilities and declining oligarchic morale as their supporters began questioning the regime's long-term viability. The battle that followed between oligarchic forces and the democratic resistance revealed the extent to which Athenian society had become polarised along class and ideological lines during the brief but intense period of the 30s' rule. The oligarchs could field approximately 3,000 troops, including the Spartan garrison and their most committed supporters, while Thrasybulus commanded a mixed force of returned exiles, disaffected citizens, and foreign volunteers who had been attracted by promises of restored democracy. The engagement occurred in the narrow streets of Piraeus, where superior numbers provided fewer advantages while individual courage and motivation proved decisive factors. The death of Critias during this urban combat eliminated the 30s' most capable and ruthless leader, while symbolically marking the beginning of their regime's final collapse. The oligarchic commander had fought with personal bravery that reflected his aristocratic background and philosophical commitment to elite rule, but his death created a leadership vacuum that his surviving colleagues proved unable to fill effectively. The psychological impact of losing their dominant figure encouraged defections among oligarchic supporters who had remained loyal primarily through fear of his retribution, rather than genuine commitment to the regime's objectives. The moderate faction within the 30, led by Theramenes before his execution by Critias, had represented the only possibility for evolutionary change that might have preserved some oligarchic innovations while accommodating popular demands for broader participation. However, the extremist policies pursued by Critias had eliminated these moderate voices while polarising the conflict between absolute oligarchy and restored democracy. The resulting situation left no room for compromise solutions that might have prevented the complete reversal of constitutional changes implemented during the oligarchic period. The Spartan response to the developing civil war in Athens reflected both their recognition that the 30s' position had become untenable and their broader strategic concerns about maintaining stability throughout their newly acquired hegemonic system. King Pausanias, representing the more moderate faction within Spartan leadership, argued for negotiated settlement that would preserve Spartan interests while avoiding the costs and risks of prolonged military intervention in Athenian domestic affairs. His position reflected understanding that excessive interference in allied internal politics might generate resentment that could threaten long-term Spartan dominance. The negotiations that followed produced the amnesty of 403 BC, one of the most remarkable acts of political reconciliation in ancient history, which enabled the restoration of democratic institutions while preventing the cycle of retribution that had characterized previous constitutional changes. The agreement prohibited prosecution for political activities during the oligarchic period, with specific exceptions only for the 30 themselves and their most direct collaborators in acts of violence. This unprecedented grant of immunity reflected both practical recognition that continued conflict would benefit only Sparta and philosophical understanding that successful democracy required the integration of diverse social groups rather than the elimination of political opponents. Thrasybulus' leadership during the transition period demonstrated both his political wisdom and his understanding that democratic restoration required careful management to avoid the extremism that had contributed to Athens' previous disasters. His policies emphasised reconciliation and reconstruction rather than revenge, while his moderate approach attracted support from citizens who had initially opposed the resistance movement but now recognised that oligarchic rule had failed to provide effective governance. The successful implementation of the amnesty created precedents for political forgiveness that would influence Greek constitutional development throughout the following centuries. The restoration of democratic institutions proceeded gradually and carefully, with traditional offices and procedures re-established, while incorporating lessons learned from the traumatic experiences of recent years. The new democracy included safeguards designed to prevent the kind of demagogic manipulation that had contributed to disasters such as the Sicilian expedition, while maintaining the popular participation that remained central to Athenian political identity. The resulting constitutional arrangements represented evolutionary development rather than simple restoration of pre-war practices. The transformation of Sparta from a liberator to hegemon revealed fundamental contradictions between their traditional domestic institutions and the requirements of managing a Greek empire that extended across the Mediterranean world. The Spartan political system, designed for governing a small citizen elite supported by helot labour and perioeci craftsmen, proved inadequate for administrating the complex network of allied cities, tribute relationships, and commercial arrangements that had previously sustained Athenian imperial power. The appointment of harmosts, Spartan governors who supervised local affairs in former Athenian territories, created new administrative structures while generating resentment among Greek cities that had expected liberation rather than new forms of foreign control. The Harma system reflected both Spartan inexperience in imperial administration and their recognition that maintaining control over distant territories required permanent military presence backed by local political arrangements favourable to Spartan interests. These governors possessed broad authority over military, financial, and judicial matters within their assigned territories, while maintaining communications with Sparta through regular reports and periodic consultations. However, their effectiveness depended heavily on individual competence and local circumstances, creating inconsistencies in imperial policy that undermined the systematic approach necessary for successful long-term administration. The financial challenges facing Spartan imperial administration exceeded anything their traditional institutions had been designed to handle, as the costs of maintaining garrisons, fleets, and administrative personnel throughout the former Athenian Empire strained resources that had previously been adequate for purely Peloponnesian concerns. The tribute system inherited from Athens required constant adjustment and enforcement, while the commercial relationships that had generated substantial revenues under democratic administration proved difficult to maintain under oligarchic governments imposed by Spartan authority. The resulting financial pressures created tensions within Spartan society, while limiting their capacity for responding effectively to new challenges. The immediate demographic catastrophe that befell Athens extended far beyond the direct casualties of warfare to encompass the broader social and economic disruption created by prolonged conflict and political upheaval. The population of Athens, which may have reached 400,000 inhabitants at the war's beginning, had been reduced by perhaps 1/3 through military losses, plague, emigration, and the economic collapse that made it impossible to support previous population levels. The skilled craftsmen, experienced administrators, and naval personnel whose expertise had sustained imperial operations were disproportionately affected, creating gaps in human resources that would require generations to restore. The destruction of physical infrastructure throughout Attica reflected both the systematic nature of Spartan operations during the war's final phase and the cumulative impact of nearly 3 decades of intermittent warfare. The silver mines at Laurium, which had provided crucial revenues for imperial administration, remained largely inoperable due to the flight of skilled slave workers and the destruction of complex drainage and processing equipment. Agricultural productivity had been severely reduced through the cutting of olive trees, the abandonment of marginal lands, and the disruption of rural communities whose social organisation had supported intensive cultivation methods. The collapse of Athenian commercial networks created economic disruption that extended throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, as trading relationships developed over decades were severed, while the financial mechanisms that had facilitated long-distance commerce were eliminated. The Athenian currency, which had served as a standard medium of exchange throughout the Aegean region, lost its credibility as the empire's political collapse undermined confidence in its long-term value. The resulting commercial uncertainty discouraged investment and innovation, while encouraging economic fragmentation that reduced overall prosperity throughout the Greek world. The end of the Athenian Empire marked the conclusion of the most successful experiment in democratic imperialism that the ancient world had witnessed, demonstrating both the remarkable achievements that popular government could accomplish and the inherent contradictions that ultimately proved fatal to its survival. The empire had enabled unprecedented cultural and intellectual development while providing economic opportunities for hundreds of thousands of individuals throughout the Mediterranean region. However, its ultimate failure revealed the difficulties of reconciling democratic ideals with imperial domination, as the very success of Athenian expansion created pressures that corrupted domestic institutions while generating external opposition that proved impossible to overcome. The long-term consequences of the Peloponnesian War extended far beyond the immediate political changes that followed Athens' surrender, fundamentally altering the trajectory of Greek historical development while creating conditions that would ultimately enable Macedonian conquest of the entire Greek world. The weakening of the traditional city-state system through prolonged warfare and internal conflict eliminated the political structures that had enabled Greek independence, while creating opportunities for external powers to exploit Greek divisions for their own advantage. The rise of Macedon under Philip II and Alexander the Great became possible largely because the Greek cities had exhausted themselves through internecine warfare that eliminated their capacity for effective collective resistance. The Persian resurgence in western Anatolia represented one of the most significant strategic consequences of Greek exhaustion, as the great king's representatives successfully exploited the conflict between Athens and Sparta to recover territories that had been lost during the previous century of Greek expansion. The gold that Cyrus the Younger and Tissaphernes had provided to Spartan naval operations represented not merely tactical support but strategic investment in Greek weakness that would enable Persian recovery of their Aegean possessions. The irony that Sparta, which had originally justified its involvement in the war as liberation of Greek cities from Athenian tyranny, ultimately delivered those same cities to Persian control, revealed the extent to which immediate tactical considerations had overwhelmed broader strategic objectives. The intellectual and cultural impact of the war's outcome proved equally significant in shaping subsequent Greek thought and political development. Thucydides' analytical approach to historical causation, developed through his direct observation of the conflict's progression, established methodological foundations for understanding political behaviour that would influence Western historical writing for millennia. His recognition that human nature remained constant while circumstances varied provided frameworks for analysing political phenomena that transcended the specific events of the Peloponnesian War, while offering insights applicable to all forms of human conflict. The philosophical implications of democratic failure during the war years contributed to the intellectual developments that would characterize 4th century Greek thought, as thinkers such as Plato and Aristotle attempted to understand the relationship between individual virtue and political institutions. The spectacle of Athenian democracy destroying its most capable leaders through jealousy and suspicion, while making disastrous strategic decisions based on emotional appeals rather than rational analysis, provided compelling evidence for arguments that popular government was inherently unstable and self-destructive. These intellectual responses to democratic failure would shape political theory throughout the Hellenistic and Roman periods, while influencing constitutional development in later historical contexts. The transformation of warfare itself represented another crucial legacy of the Peloponnesian conflict, as the traditional hoplite battles that had characterized earlier Greek military practice gave way to more complex operations involving naval forces, siege warfare, irregular tactics, and professional soldiers whose loyalty could be purchased rather than commanded through civic obligation. The employment of mercenary forces, the development of sophisticated siege equipment, and the systematic use of economic warfare as a strategic tool established precedents that would characterize subsequent military development throughout the Mediterranean world. The Peloponnesian War thus concluded not merely a particular conflict between two Greek powers, but an entire era of Greek historical development that had begun with the Persian Wars and reached its culmination in the Athenian Empire's spectacular rise and catastrophic fall. The 27 years of warfare had demonstrated both the remarkable achievements that Greek civilization could accomplish and the tragic limitations that ultimately proved fatal to its independence. The lessons learned from this great conflict would resonate throughout subsequent history, providing both inspiration for those who sought to understand the dynamics of political power and warning for those who would attempt to build lasting empires based on democratic principles. In the end, the Peloponnesian War stands as one of history's greatest cautionary tales about the corrupting effects of power, the dangers of imperial overextension, and the eternal tension between democratic ideals and the practical requirements of governing complex political systems in a competitive international environment.